For the longest time, China has been known as the world's factory. I mean, take a look at the clothes you're wearing right now, the gadgets you have in your hand, and even the property in your house. Odds are, you will find that a good many things in your possession have been either entirely manufactured in China or at some stage underwent a manufacturing process in China. This could range from your jeans, your shirt, your smartphone, or even your car, whatever it might be. The point is, it's hard to talk about global manufacturing without talking about China. Or at least it was.
China's manufacturing concerns.
China's manufacturing activity fell unexpectedly.
Investors are now wary of investing in China.
Demand for Chinese manufacturing reportedly dropped 40%.
The very catalyst that shot China to its wealth and fame, being the world factory, is eroding beneath its feet. Due to several factors, China is losing its place as the world's manufacturing hub, as it undergoes a crisis that could threaten its very GDP and even its standing in the world. Today, that is what we will talk about in depth. And in case you thought this was something limited to just your jeans and your silk shirts, you are wrong. China's manufacturing crisis has the potential to change the global dynamics of power forever. This is no exaggeration. This is a fact. Follow through with me, and I promise this will be one insightful ride. But before we dive into the nitty-gritty of China's manufacturing crisis, please take a second to hit that like button. One video I forgot to ask for a like, and that video was throttled by the algorithm. So that proves that your likes really do make a huge difference in the success of these videos. Thank you. So long as most people remember, China has been a manufacturing juggernaut. In fact, China is responsible for nearly 30% of all the manufacturing that is done on a global scale. Yeah, you heard that right. One country is responsible for 30% of the manufacturing process that happens here on planet Earth. Don't take my word for it. Take it straight from the World Economic Forum. You see, according to data published by the United Nations Statistics Division, China accounted for 28% of global manufacturing output in 2018. That puts the country more than 10 percentage points ahead of the United States, which used to have the world's largest manufacturing sector until China overtook it in 2010. When China stepped up, unfaltering during an age of its great boom, it simply took the button and hit the ground running. As more factories were built, manufacturing started to contribute more and more to China's GDP. By 2018, with the total value added by the Chinese manufacturing sector amounting to almost $4 trillion, manufacturing as a sector now accounted for nearly 30% of China's GDP. To see how huge this figure is, all you need to do is compare it to the United States, where manufacturing contributed to just 11% of the nation's GDP. It's a big difference, isn't it? In all fairness, a part of why that is so is because a lot of US manufacturing work was delegated to China. It's not just the US. Several nations let China take care of their manufacturing, with multiple big companies setting up shop in China. But why is that so? Why China and not their own home nations? Well, several factors contributed to China's rise in manufacturing grace. I must mention them now, as I'll be breaking them down in just a bit very soon. The factors that really catapulted China to a place of advantage were basically low labor costs, strong business ecosystems, a lack of regulatory compliance, low taxes and duties, and competitive currency practices. Combined, China had the perfect melting pot, or should I say a factory, that was unbeatable on a global scale. Countries like the US stopped investing so much in their own manufacturing industries, and they found it cheaper to just let China do the manufacturing. Although this led to the rise of manufacturing in China, it did accelerate the collapse of several local industries and the closure of factories in said countries. I will perhaps explore this more in depth in another video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see a video about that. Okay, so now we've established that China was the undisputed manufacturing hub of the world, and we have established the factors that led to that. Let's now talk about how they got into this crisis. Just before we get into that juicy bit, I want to touch on how China, using its manufacturing prowess, changed the geopolitical landscape. Understanding how China leveraged its position on the global stage will make you better understand what this devastating manufacturing crisis means for the communist nation. There really is more on the line than just economic trouble. Okay, so the China we all now know is a superpower, a world shaker. But that success it enjoys on the global stage comes as a result of its economic successes, much of which was spearheaded by the manufacturing industry. You would not be wrong to say that no other country in modern history has reshaped the landscape of global politics as China has done. On the back of the manufacturing, China rapidly transformed its economy from a low-cost factory to the world to a global leader in advanced technologies, all while transforming global supply chains drastically. It is no accident that China enjoys benefits on the global stage that can only be eclipsed by the United States, and in some cases, even that is debatable. China has won the game of international diplomacy, leveraging its success to become the primary trading and development partner for emerging economies across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Africa particularly has given China the platform to shine, further elevating the Eastern nation to a status of international dominance. When it comes to Africa, China has 4 overarching strategic interests. In a second, we'll get into that. Right now, let's quickly talk about some new changes to YouTube. I'm sure some of you guys have noticed that whenever you go to your homepage on YouTube, you get some videos recommended from channels that are extremely new. Here's an example. This change is relatively new, and it actually provides a perfect opportunity for new channels to get started and grow quickly. In fact, many channels have used this exact thing to grow an audience in the last 12 months. They have gotten millions of views and made thousands of dollars from them. In fact, there are millions of faceless YouTube channels making content and earning ad revenue. In just the last 3 years, YouTube has paid out $70 billion to creators. That's around $60 million every single day. So if you're someone who's interested in starting a YouTube channel, right now is the perfect time. That's why we've launched a completely free 7-day email crash course on how to start and grow a faceless YouTube channel. If that's something you're interested in, you can sign up now for free by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. Alright, now let's get back to the topic at hand. When it comes to Africa, China has 4 overarching strategic interests. First, it wants and has had access to natural resources, particularly oil and gas. It is estimated that soon China will import more oil worldwide than the United States. To guarantee future supply, China is heavily investing in the oil sectors in countries such as the Sudan, Angola, and Nigeria. All of this is done on the backs of its economic partnerships. Second, investments in Africa. A huge market for Chinese exported goods might facilitate China's efforts to restructure its own economy away from labor-intensive industries, especially as labor costs in China increase. Yeah, hold that thought there. I'll circle back to this very soon. China also wants political legitimacy. The Chinese government believes that strengthening Sino-African relations helps raise China's own international influence, and this is actually happening. Most African governments express support for Beijing's One China policy, a prerequisite for attracting Chinese aid and investment. What is the island nation of Taiwan in the face of a $1 billion aid package, right? Finally, China has sought a more constructive role as a contributor to stability in the region, partially to mitigate security-related threats to Chinese economic interests. In that same basket, Africa looks to China for certain things. Several African governments look to China to provide political recognition and legitimacy, and to contribute to their economic development through aid, investment, infrastructure development, and trade. Where China shines in a way that even the US can't is that China, through its vast resources, as a result of its booming manufacturing sector, relates to African nations differently. Unlike most European and American aid packages, China only engages African nations economically without condescendingly preaching about good governance. It is hard to get a US aid package that does not tie in some sort of political favors, to African nations at least. China also funds high-risk projects and projects in remote regions that are not appealing to Western governments or companies. You would be well within your rights to say that corrupt politicians take advantage of this and also take a good portion of these packages to feast on. but it does not eliminate the fact that China sends the money. This relationship that China has managed to cultivate only through economic prowess can be traced back to its manufacturing industry. What I'm trying to say, in essence, is that China's rise in manufacturing has given it an economic advantage that has allowed it to blossom. The geopolitical relationships it has leveraged have elevated the country's status to an untouchable superpower. Powerful African nations like these have all borrowed from China, thereby putting them in a position where, though not obligatory, is more beneficial for them to advance Chinese dominance globally by pushing forward a Chinese agenda. China's economic power has also resulted in somewhat negative global implications. As more and more countries rely upon China's manufacturing industry to process or make certain goods at low prices, this has given China a position of leverage that to some degree has been abused. While this entirely depends on what angle you're looking at this from, under the reign of the CCP and President Xi, China has become more vocal about its power aspirations, and it has taken a more assertive international posture. This is especially so regarding Taiwan and China's several territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Combined with Beijing's military modernization program that has put Asia, as well as the United States, on notice that China's economic power will have geopolitical implications. Seeing how Russia recently abused its military might to invade a sovereign nation, none would put it past China to use its economic and military might to do the same. In fact, many say that China is using Russia as a blueprint for when they invade Taiwan. Also, because China is the economic powerhouse of BRICS, the BRICS group is gaining power and influence that is destabilizing the current world order. Whether that will be for the best or not is a topic I'll visit in a separate video. But the point is, China is most certainly, and has most certainly, changed the geopolitical landscape. None of this could have been possible were it not for the economic power that the nation derived from its manufacturing industry, which has both brought economic benefits and leverage to the Eastern nation. Now that we've established what manufacturing as an industry has done for China, let's dive directly into why the nation is facing a manufacturing crisis and what shall become of it. This is the juicy part. You don't want to miss this. If you're enjoying the video so far, I'm sure you'll enjoy my other videos, but according to YouTube, almost 70% of you are not subscribed? Please, take a second and subscribe down below. China's manufacturing crisis did not just emerge overnight, no. It was as a result of several factors that built up in the past few years. I won't go into every minor incident, but two main umbrella things deserve mention as they are accelerated by the collapse of China's manufacturing incident. What are they? Let's get into them. The first, of course, includes the US, because what's a little China without US rivalry?
We'll take you straight to the White House. The President of the United States announcing new trade tariffs against
China.
Trade tensions are flaring up between the U.S. and China.
Trump announcing plans to increase tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods.
I happen to think that tariffs for a country are very powerful.
And trade war. China is now punching back.
China has a 10-year, 20-year, 50-year plan.
They've done some things that we don't agree with.
You have a chance to see the new Cold War.
China, due to the manufacturing and growth of its economy, has emerged as the sole rival to the United States' hegemony in the New World Order. In fact, when you measure the two in terms of PPP, otherwise known as purchasing power parity, China pulls ahead. All this naturally puts China at odds with the US and creates, well, some sort of tension. In 2019, China's total exports reached $2.5 trillion, with the United States being the top importer with nearly 20% share. Of course, importing so heavily from your competitor is not good for optics, so the US administration decided to impose a 25% tariff on selected goods from China. Trade deficits between the US and China are what had primarily propelled the imposition of these tariffs on China. The tariffs were followed by restrictions on both China's access to high-tech US products and foreign investments involving security concerns and by allegations of unfair Chinese commercial practices. This was not taken kindly by China, who retaliated in their own way, but the point is, the damage was done. When the country that imports a fifth of your goods pulls back even a little, you are bound to feel the effects. The US's actions on China, though improving things domestically, disrupted the global supply chain and slowed the growth of China's manufacturing industry. You can't keep improving and expanding when a fifth of your market vanishes overnight. The ensuing trade war that took place between China and the US was brutal, and it shook the financial markets of the world. Ultimately, though, it came to a heel and had heavily affected the relationship between these two top economic superpowers, drawing them both to a state of caution. In fact, I would be remiss to say the trade war is over. It is more like it has shifted to a Cold War, where tensions just run deep and paper-thin diplomacy protects the peace. And even when a new American administration came into place, nothing changed. Despite pleas from the US business community to ease tensions, US President Joe Biden so far has amplified Trump's policies by strengthening anti-China alliances and implementing additional sanctions. In fact, in October of last year, President Biden rolled out extensive new restrictions on China's access to advanced semiconductors and the equipment used to make them. These particular restrictions require an almost impossible-to-acquire license for the sale of advanced semiconductors to entities within China. This move, as was expected of it, largely deprives the Asian giant of the computing power it needs to train artificial intelligence at scale. The rules imposed also further cripple China as it robs them of their much-needed US talent, and it further cripples their own semiconductor supply chain. I have mentioned this before, semiconductors are the lifeblood of any manufacturing or even processing industry. Now that Biden has cut China off from that, well, it's a crisis. It is no exaggeration to say that about the two nations' political ties, this could be the single most impactful and substantial move by the US government to date in its quest to undermine Chinese technology capabilities. Its effects shall reverberate throughout the years, and we can only start to understand the extent of the damage as time moves on, and China falls behind other emerging hungry nations. In his eyes, Biden now characterizes the US-China conflict as a battle between the utility of democracies in the 21st century and autocracies. This all plays out negatively for China, as the US and their allies become less reliant on the nation as they start to look for manufacturing elsewhere. And remember, the money goes where the manufacturing is, and the money leaves where the manufacturing isn't. It really is just that simple. Now China is losing support for what it had made the backbone of its economy. This is the first factor that is resulting in the manufacturing crisis the nation is now in. The second major factor needs no introduction. We all know it, and it was quite a pandemic. Literally.
Chinese health authorities are still working to identify the virus in the central city of Wuhan.
At least 59 people are believed to have been sickened by the new virus.
Fast-breaking developments in the coronavirus emergency.
Wuhan, Shenzhen,
Beijing.
And a lockdown as COVID-19 spreads.
COVID-19 cases in China are surging, and that's leading to key factory closures.
Normally busy roads were hushed as most people acted on the government's new measures.
Factories have been closing down in China.
China is struggling with a rapid rise in new coronavirus infections.
Many of the country's 1.4 billion residents remain vulnerable to the virus.
COVID-19 quite literally reshaped the way the world does business. When it hit at its peak, the pandemic shut down the global supply chain, taking all of China's business with it. Question this: what happens to a country that is dependent on manufacturing the world's goods when, well, the world closes up shop? It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. It was an absolute disaster. China, which has arguably been hit the hardest by the pandemic, faced a severe closing of factories. Together with the CCP's zero-COVID policy, a policy that was so bent on eradicating COVID that it heavily punished its own citizens, China just went downhill. By the time factories started trying to open again, the world had somewhat moved on. And now China was left to figure out the absolute disaster of a mess they were left with. In addition to that, the pandemic showed many multinational companies just how much they depend on Chinese manufacturing. This came as a shock, as many realized that everything, from raw materials to contract manufacturing to production facilities, were entirely based on the Chinese supply chain. In a bid to rectify that, so that unlike COVID times they would never be caught out in the rain, several multinational companies started looking for alternative locations. This brings us to one of the reasons why China is in a manufacturing crisis. Put simply, it is the change in micro trends. Everyone seems to be running out of China. But the question is, why? This is something we started to see seriously during the height of the US-China trade war. Because of the conflicts and the harsh measures the two countries were imposing on each other, companies from both countries suffered the brunt of it. This inevitably saw many major companies moving out of China in the search for survival. In fact, the country's export business was stagnant in 2019 for the first time in decades, and the impact trickled down to an array of industries. In fact, between 2018 and 2019, there was no noticeable trade growth, as you can see from this. This decline has only worsened as major companies continue to leave China. In fact, it has been estimated that around 40% of companies have relocated or are considering relocating their manufacturing out of China, according to a 2019 survey on tariffs conducted by AmCham Shanghai and the Chinese government.
So Hasbro, Nike, they want to leave the country.
Apple speeding up plans to shift manufacturing away from China, triggered by recent unrest in the nation.
Foxconn wants to boost its production in India as the company seeks alternative production sites outside of China.
Many of these nations are moving to other Southeast Asian countries, not just because of the push factors, but because of certain pull factors as well. In fact, when you analyze them in a nutshell, the manufacturing in China can be narrowed down to simply push and pull factors. Push factors that are pushing major companies and their manufacturing out of China, and pull factors that are attracting them to other places. Let's examine these together, shall we? Remember when I talked about the factors that led China to global dominance in the manufacturing space? Well, one of them was the low cost of labor. With a massive workforce, the biggest at that time, and super low cost of labor, China was unbeatable. Well, until now. You see, that low cost of labor China used to boast about is no more. The cost of production in China, especially in the major coastal cities, is on the rise, fueled by escalating wages and skyrocketing real estate rent and valuation. Labor costs alone have been growing 7% year over year for the past 5 years, and these are expected to keep rising. It makes sense, though. When a nation starts to develop and moves from developing nation to a developed nation, well, costs increase. As the cost of living goes up, so too do the wages of the workers. One thing that big companies like Nike or Adidas do not like is, well, high cost of production. As wages have risen, these major companies have started to leave China in search of better lands. Oh, I mean cheaper lands. This has seen a lot of big companies direct their attention to other nations that offer much lower costs of production. These nations include countries such as Vietnam and Indonesia that, unlike China, are still ridiculously cheap to produce goods en masse. In fact, let's talk about those countries for a little bit. I'll bring this home for a bit so we understand it better. Of all the exports that China has lost to the US market, more than a third of that has been in the hands of nations like Vietnam, India, and Thailand. These are nations that simply produce products at a much lower cost than what China does. I will now talk about how China is moving into high-value manufacturing soon, whereas these countries are still low-cost, traditional manufacturing countries. This means that for most companies, it is simply cheaper from a resource and labor perspective to move to other nations. And to be honest, this is the nature of business. Everyone wants to keep their costs low, and unfortunately for China, this is coming at the expense of their industry, as other countries take the bag from them. The largest beneficiary of China's manufacturing crisis is arguably Vietnam. Let's look at that in depth in just a few minutes. For now, we also have other factors that are in play in China's manufacturing crisis. Let's look at them. China's new direction is, well, not really helpful right now. China has decided to evolve its manufacturing into high-tech, high-value industry. Over the past few years, China has poured more than $1.5 billion into its Made in China 2025 strategy, in a bid to transform manufacturing into high-end tech-focused industry. The goal of this is to stimulate the creation of higher-level jobs that add more value to the manufacturing industry. What China is basically looking to do is substitute traditional low-margin manufacturing with innovative sectors, such as next-generation IT, advanced engineering, the Internet of Things, and smart appliances. This is meant to elevate China when it comes to the value chain. The powers that be in China have made this the new direction. Without a shadow of a doubt, China's manufacturing future is aimed at the higher value addition sector that is already on the rise. On the other hand, traditional labor-intensive manufacturing, which requires a low-cost ecosystem to flourish, will continue to diminish or be moved to other sectors. Long-term, this might be in line with what China as a nation plans to do, but in the short term, it's chasing away companies from the nation. The primary reason why most countries made their base there in the first place was because of the low cost associated with production in China, due to its traditional manufacturing industry. Their moving away from that is somewhat of a betrayal to companies that are attracted there because of that. It's like liking someone because their teeth look a certain way and then boom, they get braces. Though it is good for them, it takes away from that charm that brought you there in the first place. Hey, don't shoot the messenger. I'm simply letting you know why big companies are moving out of China en masse. Because of the uncertainty that sometimes comes with such massive sector changes, these big companies are starting to diversify and expand their manufacturing hubs to other geographies for supply security. This means that investments that could have been otherwise locked into China are now distributed to various places. This not only erodes China's position as the sole option for most of these countries, but it essentially diminishes the role that China plays in this chain. But to be fair, China's new direction is partially necessitated by the fact that, well, the nation's youth despise traditional factory jobs. And don't just take my word for it. Listen to this.
The limitless wave of cheap labor that helped propel the extraordinary boom in its economy is coming to an end.
China's economy is suffering from a strange mismatch between jobs available and the qualifications of the job seekers.
There's been a huge expansion in higher education, an enormous increase in the number of graduates.
This suggests a mismatch between supply and demand for low-skilled workers.
You don't find people who are willing to work in factories.
The upcoming generations of China have a deeply rooted resentment of factory jobs, and this is now contributing to a deepening labor shortage that is frustrating manufacturers in China. Do you see the irony of it all? A country of over 1.4 billion people has a labor shortage. Wow. I guess economics and the market have a sense of humor, don't they? The situation is so severe that more than 80% of Chinese manufacturers face labor shortages, ranging from hundreds to thousands of workers. In most cases, this is equivalent to 10 to 30% of these big companies' entire workforce. You can imagine how badly these industries are underperforming right now. China's Ministry of Education, which is notorious for biased estimates, forecasts a shortage of nearly 30 million manufacturing workers by 2025, larger than Australia's population. You can bet your bottom dollar that the actual figures are likely much higher. When all this is said and done, manufacturers say they have three main options to tackle the labor market mismatch. That is to either sacrifice profit margins to increase wages, invest more in automation, or move to cheaper pastures like Vietnam or India. As I've said before regarding cheap labor, Vietnam, India, and other nations are starting to prove to be the answer to this problem. So, since you guys have made it this far, I'm guessing you guys love keeping up with geopolitical news, right? Well, I've recently launched my own geopolitical newsletter called Global Recaps, where I send weekly emails covering the most important geopolitical news in a simple manner. You can sign up below, and best of all, it's completely free. There have also been several internal pressures that worked against China. For starters, the trade war, together with diminishing local industries and growing unemployment, have led some developed countries to offer subsidies and tax incentives to their local companies. This has been done in a bid to encourage their local companies to move manufacturing back home to boost the economy. This is a trend that has been forming more strongly in developed countries. Even in the US, we've seen this happening. starting from the Trump administration proposing tax credits for U.S. companies that relocate their manufacturing facilities to the United States from China. In Asia, Japan's $2.2 billion stimulus package aims to help manufacturers bring production home, or to other countries after the coronavirus pandemic disrupted supply chains and exposed an over-reliance on China. These examples are less of an equation of low costs and more a focus on navigating a geopolitical agenda and alleviating supply chain risks. Ultimately, however, they all add to the manufacturing crisis that China now has on their hands. Also, we have seen, especially in the US, a change in sentiment towards Chinese-made products. This might be particularly worse in America because of the trade war, geopolitics, the spying accusations, well, okay, you get the point. China doesn't have the best relationship with the US. In fact, according to a Reuters Ipsos survey, 70% of Americans prefer goods made in the United States. Now, the challenge remains that production in the US, or most developed nations, is still far higher than just exporting to other Asian nations. But still, those are factors that warrant a different discussion. Whether production is moved away to the US or Vietnam, the key point is that China loses either way, having been cut off from the conversation. Now, let's take a look at the winners amidst China's misfortune.
Now, India's growing prominence as a manufacturing hub gets yet another confirmation.
Foxconn wants to boost its production in India as the company seeks alternative production sites outside of China.
Samsung set up a plant in the Bac Ninh region of Vietnam to reduce its dependence on China.
Being in India is vital to Tim Cook and to Apple for the production.
Tesla has proposed to set up a factory to produce electric cars for local sale and export.
Thailand, Vietnam, and India benefiting from China's mistake.
I'm tempted to call these nations the nightmares of the CCP. But, I mean, that seems just a tad dramatic, right? Anyway, let's go through them starting with Vietnam. Vietnam alone has taken up over half of the US imports that shifted from China to other nations. This was such a huge market and opportunity for Vietnam that it has since boosted Vietnam's GDP by over 7.9%. This has been most notable in industries that have focused on the export of things such as furniture, footwear, apparel, electronics components, and machinery. To date, the US remains Vietnam's largest export market, accounting for 29.4% of total merchandise exports. Vietnam's exports to the US rose by 13.6% in 2022, with the bilateral trade surplus with the US increasing to $95 billion. Looks to me like Vietnam is coming for all that China has. What mainly appeals to the international community and US companies specifically is the nation's low labor costs. The very same advantages that drove China to greatness are now attracting a large pool of manufacturers to Vietnam. Several large manufacturing companies have announced plans to shift or expand manufacturing out of China and into Vietnam. This includes Foxconn, Apple's largest contract manufacturer, who signed a $300 million deal to expand in northern Vietnam with a new factory that will generate 30,000 jobs. This huge spending was in addition to the $1.5 billion that the Vietnamese government had said Foxconn had already invested in the country. Those sound like some pretty heavy investments, if you ask me. When you look at the facts of the matter, it becomes easy to see why. This excerpt from the New York Times puts it perfectly. A billboard outside a Foxconn factory in Bac Ninh advertised that the company is looking to hire 5,000 workers urgently, with an offer of roughly $300 in monthly payments for an entry-level position. It is less than half of the monthly pay, about 4,500 yuan or $650, that Foxconn is offering new hires at its assembly lines in Shenzhen in southeastern China. Yes, you heard that right. Vietnam employees in this instance are paid less than half of what Chinese employees are. What this simply means is that the cost of production in China would be substantially higher than in Vietnam. Any good businessman will tell you to expand operations where it's cheaper. In this case, that's Vietnam. Now you understand why Foxconn keeps investing in Vietnam. It too is looking to reap the benefits that come from cheap labor. Why pay more when you can get the same for free? Ugh, I bet some capitalist sweatshop is probably going to make that their new logo. I should probably take that back while I still can. What makes Vietnam's future bright is that it is not only more traditional labor-intensive industries such as apparel, footwear, and outdoor hard goods that are getting boosted in the nation. Much like we have seen with Foxconn and Apple, the electrical and electronics sector is set to become the next big thing to flourish in the nation. Even Samsung plans to move its display production out of China. And that's no small feat. This move alone will make Vietnam the world's leading display supplier. Just think about that. And let's just look at the numbers for a brief second. Due to its capitalization of China's manufacturing crisis, Vietnam has a strong economic expansion projected over the next decade. The nation's total GDP is forecast to increase from $327 billion in 2022 to $470 billion by 2025, rising to $760 billion by 2030. Those are not small numbers. All this translates to very rapid growth in Vietnam's per capita GDP, from $3,330 per year in 2022 to $4,700 per year by 2025 and $7,400 by 2030, resulting in a substantial expansion of the size of Vietnam's domestic consumer market. Vietnam has the opportunity and potential to become a juggernaut and more of a threat to China than it already is. Look out, China, Vietnam might just be your boogeyman in the making. Its role as a low-cost manufacturing hub is also expected to continue to grow strongly, helped by the further expansion of existing major industry sectors, notably textiles and electronics, as well as the development of new industry sectors such as autos and petrochemicals. Vietnam already has a domestic automaker of electric vehicles, VinFast, which launched its first EV in Vietnam in 2021. The company is growing, and as it does, it attracts competition, or in this case, manufacturing companies, to China. The last point to note when it comes to Vietnam is that its rise has been boosted by China's downfall, as the pandemic exposed, well, a lot of things. For starters, the world's big companies saw significant supply chain vulnerabilities during that period. Having seen the challenges that came with centralizing the global supply chains in China, most multinationals have been seeking expansion. And guess what? Vietnam has just been in a prime position to answer that call. And this issue is not closed either. It will drive the further reshaping of manufacturing supply chains over the medium term, as firms try to reduce their vulnerability to such extreme supply chain disruptions due to anything whatsoever. Add to all that the US-China trade and technology tensions still remain high, and what you have is the perfect concoction for the reconfiguration of supply chains. There is no doubt in my mind that Vietnam is going to come out as a winner from China's wires. But here's the kicker. They're not the only nation that stands to benefit significantly. India is another of the nations that are looking to capitalize on China's misfortunes. India, maybe more so than Vietnam, has a lot of things going for it. For starters, India boasts a large landmass and an abundance of labor due to its young population. This year, India surpassed China as the most populous country, and so they are covered in terms of labor. Unlike China, India's labor is not expensive, and hence they have the advantage. Certain companies have since noticed this and taken advantage. One example of this is Apple, which has already moved some of its iPhone production to the Indian states of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, and is exploring moving its iPad manufacturing to the South Asian nation. JP Morgan analysts even made calculations, and their projections show that 1 in 4 iPhones would be made in India by 2025. India is simply capitalizing on the vulnerabilities that COVID-19 exposed against China. The need for Apple to reduce its dependence on China as a manufacturing center has been clear for many years, but the impact of the pandemic at the world's biggest iPhone assembly plant underlined the problem. The COVID-19 related disruption was estimated to cost the company $1 billion weekly. It makes sense that Apple wants to avoid such a mess again. Julie Girdman, the CEO of Everstream, a platform for supply chain risk management, said in a statement, India has a large labor pool, a long history of manufacturing, and government support for boosting industry and exports. Because of this, many are exploring whether Indian manufacturing is a viable alternative to China. The Indian government is welcome to deals, as Indian Prime Minister Modi has been working on attracting foreign direct investments since he took office in 2014, sending FDI to a record $83.6 billion in the past fiscal year. With low-cost labor available, low cost of production, and a willing government, it's not hard to see why a good portion of business is leaving China for India. At the current rate, India stands to take a lot of China's business. And again, it's not the only one. We also have the land of Muay Thai. Thailand is perhaps an unexpected winner from China's manufacturing crisis. When you take a second look, however, you realize this was meant to happen. As Southeast Asia's second largest economy, Thailand has been moving up the value chain in manufacturing and is a production hub for car parts, vehicles, and electronics. Even major companies like Sony and Sharp have set up shop there. Sony said in 2019 it was closing its Beijing smartphone plant to cut costs and relocate some of the production to Thailand. Following that, Sharp said in the same year it was moving some of its printer production to Thailand because of the US-China trade war. All these actions prove that Thailand's competitive advantage keeps getting stronger, and hence multinationals are flocking to it. Now, before you start claiming that it's just foreign companies doing this, let me add this little fact. Even Chinese companies are moving out of China to manufacture elsewhere. Ugh, yikes. Companies producing solar panels, such as Shanghai's Jinko Solar, are moving their production to Thailand to take advantage of lower costs and avoid geopolitical tensions that China is always in the middle of. Amidst all of this, Thailand has just seen its foreign direct investments rise substantially. Between 2020 and 2021 alone, its foreign direct investments tripled, putting the country in a significantly better position. This was during COVID. One can only imagine the doors that will keep opening up for the country now that the global supply chains are being rewritten. And if you thought these were all the wins for Asia, well, you got another thing coming. We have other countries taking China's pie. Bangladesh is another of what you can deem China's competition. It has been a big beneficiary of the supply chain shift away from China, and its competitive advantage just keeps growing. The nation found its niche in the garment manufacturing sector, and it has heavily capitalized on this. The garment manufacturing industry is a key pillar of their economy, accounting for nearly 85% of shipments, or over $42 billion of the country's exports in 2021. The country is also the world's second largest garments exporter after China. Considering the size and resource disparity, that is quite impressive. Of its many advantages, Bangladesh's rise could perhaps be accredited to rising labor costs in China, whereas Bangladesh labor, in comparison, is significantly cheaper. Let me give you some numbers so you can really appreciate the difference. The average monthly salary of a worker in Bangladesh is $120, whereas in China it is $670. Say you owned a manufacturing company. Where would you rather set up in light of these costs? As Bangladesh continues to attract investments beyond the garment sector into other industries, I wonder how explosive their growth will and can be. Talking about explosive growth, let's look at Mexico. If you're not rooting for Vietnam, then you're probably on Team Mexico. What Mexico has in its hands is a golden opportunity as it stands to greatly benefit from China's manufacturing crisis. The North American nation is directly taking on China in the manufacturing market, and it's doing quite well at it. As US-China trade relations have continued to sour, it has been estimated by the UN that approximately $27 billion of lost trade between the two will be captured by Mexico. Yeah, you heard that right. That's billion with a capital B. And these aren't just random projections either, no sir. The food, basic metals, mining, pharmaceutical, and automotive sectors are projected to invest the most in the country. The latter a vital strategic part of North America's strategy to decouple its supply chain from the East and set up locally. Even Ford, the vehicle giant, has invested $260 million in its new global technology and business center in Mexico, while Volkswagen was reported to be investing an eye-watering $763 million in its electric vehicle plant. Flavio Barreros, managing director and Latin America supply chain lead at ActionSir, said in a statement, "There is mainly an upside to investing in the country, as North American manufacturers have a history of working cross-border with both Canada and Mexico, from raw materials through semi-finished goods to finished goods. Mexico will represent a key area of growth, representing 1/3 of new employment, particularly in automobile and food manufacturing." And you can't argue with how true this rings. I could talk about Malaysia and even other nations, but I'm sure you get the point. There are other nations whose own industries are on the rise, and any slip-ups by China are the windows for these nations to capitalize on and thrive on. Despite China's own slip-ups, these nations are emerging with just better competitive advantage, and that is giving them the platform to level up and potentially surpass China in the years to come. So, what are we left with at the end of the day? Let me state this unequivocally, lest there is a misunderstanding. As of now, China is still the world's factory. As much as there is emerging competition, China is still far above competing nations. Neither Southeast Asia nor India can replace China as the global manufacturing hub overnight. This is because they are mainly engaged in labor-intensive and low-value-added manufacturing, the very trend that China seeks to move away from. These emerging markets also don't have industrial chains and supply chains that are as complete as those of China. They might in the future, but I'm basing this off of today. What further gives China the edge that keeps them in the game is that they not only are a manufacturing hub, but China itself is a market for these goods. Based on its spending habits and large population, it provides the market for its goods. Don't believe me? In 2020, global companies had $1.4 trillion of domestic sales within the nation, far more than their exports of $900 billion. This means that they exported less than they sold. Tell me what manufacturer doesn't like that? That being said, countries like India boast similar advantages, or rather, the potential for similar advantages. Over time, assuming the same factors come into play, then yes, there is potential for such a drastic shift. In fact, the presence of nations like India is what is causing the manufacturing crisis in part from China. Only time will tell what will become of China's manufacturing industry as it is pitted against the younger but more competitive manufacturing industries of other nations. I will certainly work on an update as the situation evolves, but until then, only time can tell what will come of this globe-threatening manufacturing crisis. Mexico's economy is on the rise. An increasing number of foreign businesses like to do business in Mexico, and it looks like this will only increase in the future. Right now, Mexico sits in the perfect storm, preparing it for an economic boom. This is due to multiple factors, both inside of Mexico and also outside in the changing international landscape. Mexico has relatively low labor costs, which attracts manufacturers looking to outsource their operations. Additionally, the country's population can provide a lot of skilled labor, which makes doing business in Mexico even more attractive. And something that separates Mexico from all the other low-cost manufacturing countries is one simple geographic reality. Mexico is located right next to the largest economy in the world, the United States of America. It's not hard to figure out why businesses like this fact. When you manufacture your products in Mexico, you can easily and cheaply export your products to the huge market in the United States. So, Mexico is a huge opportunity for manufacturing, which can attract businesses and spark economic growth. And the changing global economic environment is turning this opportunity into a reality. Right now, the United States outsources a lot of its manufacturing to China. But due to a variety of reasons, this trend seems to be shifting. It's only a matter of time before China's position as the manufacturing behemoth will crumble. China's downfall will inevitably cause Mexico's economic rise, because Chinese manufacturing will have to move somewhere else. But in a weird way, Beijing is actually trying to benefit from Mexico's rise by gaining an economic footprint in the country. In this episode, we'll go over how these complex geopolitical and economic changes are causing an economic boom in Mexico. What's happening in Mexico is very interesting, because it doesn't only affect one nation, but really the entire world. And just a side note, if you enjoy my videos, be sure to hit that like button down below. Without your help, this video won't get very far in the algorithm. It took a lot of work to cover this topic, so your support is really greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
A tectonic shift is underway in the North American economy.
We are seeing a lot of investment from Chinese companies, and Mexico is more motivated to attract them.
The latest example of Chinese business expansion is the 850-hectare Hafusan Industrial Park.
The potential for creating as many as 7,000 jobs over the next 5 years.
And bringing their products closer to the world's largest market, the United States.
Multiple Chinese companies are now moving their manufacturing to Mexico. They've already invested billions of dollars in the country, building up factories and supply chains. This is a fascinating development because it tells us two important things. Mexico is now a very attractive place to do business, and China is, well, not that attractive anymore. After all, why are Chinese companies moving out of China if things are going well at home? The truth is, it's not going well for the country. Since the COVID pandemic hit in 2020, things are going downhill in China. The first thing we should look at are the supply chain weaknesses that were exposed during the recent years. This isn't the first time you'll hear about globalization and outsourcing manufacturing, as these concepts have shaped our modern economy. Basically, companies from Western countries have moved their manufacturing to other, cheaper countries. For decades, globalization has been a trend that countries like China benefited from enormously. Because other countries started to outsource their manufacturing, China became a manufacturing giant. China had an abundance of cheap labor, which made it the best place for manufacturing businesses. But this globalization had one huge disadvantage. It makes countries reliant on other countries. China is the world's top manufacturer, producing 28.7% of the world's manufacturing output. Because of this huge market share, global supply chains are largely reliant on the Chinese economy. And when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, this overdependence on the Chinese economy clearly showed. The long and ruthless lockdowns in China caused economic unrest and supply chain weaknesses all over the world. A lot of governments came to the same conclusion. It's not smart to have all your manufacturing in one country. Diversifying your manufacturing by outsourcing it to different countries is a lot safer, even though it comes with a heavier price tag due to more investments. For example, Apple is now diversifying its manufacturing by adding Indian companies to its supply chain. The Chinese companies moving to Mexico might be doing the same thing, diversifying their manufacturing. If something unfortunate were to happen in China, these companies would still have their manufacturing plants in Mexico up and running. But supply chain safety isn't the only motivator driving these companies in Mexico. Cheap labor certainly has a huge role to it. The quoted monthly earnings in Mexico are $874, which is significantly lower than China's quoted earnings of $1,336 per month. Chinese manufacturers want to make money, and by moving to Mexico, this gets easier due to the lower labor costs. And the costs of labor aren't the only explanation. In China, many manufacturing companies are facing acute labor shortages. The new Chinese generation is smaller than the older ones, and many young Chinese people aren't willing to work factory jobs. The reason for this is that the new generation has a higher education than the previous one, making them, well, overqualified for manual work. Basically, there are less people in China, and even less of them considering low-paying jobs. This has led to more than 80% of Chinese manufacturers facing labor shortages from 10% up to 30%. If these manufacturers don't have the people at home, they're forced to move abroad. And Chinese companies moving to Mexico fit perfectly in this trend. But the reasons for things going downhill in China aren't only economic, they're also heavily political. The turmoil that began with the US-China trade war has caused significant damage to Chinese manufacturing. In 2018, US President Donald Trump began to impose high tariffs on imports from China, which hurt Chinese businesses wanting to export to the huge US market. In one single move, he increased the taxes on $200 billion worth of goods. And President Biden, Well, he didn't make the situation a whole lot better for these Chinese companies. His administration maintained the tariffs Trump imposed, which didn't help with stopping the trade war. He even went as far as to add new restrictions on the Chinese economy, most notably on the chip industry that is so crucial to the country. In deals with other countries like Japan or the Netherlands, Biden effectively destroyed the supply chains of Chinese chip manufacturers. For Chinese companies exporting to the United States, this ongoing trade war is very bad for business. This is yet another reason for Chinese manufacturing companies to now move to Mexico. Mexico is located right next to the US market, and it doesn't have the same restrictions placed on itself as China has. Adding on to this, diversifying your manufacturing to other countries is a smart move due to the same political reasons. With the situation around Taiwan getting very tense, a conflict between the United States and China is not completely out of the picture. An American four-star general predicts that the two will be at war by 2025. Now, this is a topic for a whole nother video, but these speculations do concern companies about potential geopolitical risks of doing business in China. Maybe it's safer if you have some of your manufacturing elsewhere, because a war will be pretty devastating for everyone involved. And in the terrible scenario that comes with a war, there's a good chance Mexico won't be involved. In short, there are a lot of economic and political reasons for Chinese companies now moving over to Mexico. And it isn't just Chinese companies that are moving out of their own country for Mexico. Other companies are seeing the benefits of Mexico too. American businesses that were formerly outsourcing their manufacturing to China are now considering moving to their neighboring country. For example, the car manufacturers Tesla, General Motors, and Ford are all building manufacturing plants in Mexico. And companies from Europe and other Asian countries are doing the same, especially when the United States is their primary export market. It's safe to say that the trend in global manufacturing is shifting. China's downfall in manufacturing is turning out to be Mexico's rise. As with every trend, there are push and pull factors. The push factors are that China isn't that attractive anymore for manufacturing. We've already discussed the reasons for this, which are both economic and political. So let's go over the pull factors and uncover why Mexico has great potential to be a manufacturing economy.
Mexico has surpassed China as America's top trading partner, signaling a changing dynamic within the global economy.
Mexico hosted the North American Summit with the leaders of the United States and Canada.
The North American Leaders Summit is expected to focus on economic issues and climate change, but also the situation on the U.S.-Mexican border.
Perhaps one of the greatest pull factors driving manufacturers to Mexico is the end of globalism. Many experts are speculating that globalism is reaching its final days. This major shift has to do with the increasing international tensions in the world. One of the preconditions for globalism has always been international peace and order. Connecting each individual economy with each other to form a global economy isn't an easy task. You need to have everyone on the same page, and you must provide every country with safety and assurances. After the Second World War, the United States was so strong that it could enforce this. The US-led world order provided relative stability, which led to an increasingly globalized economy as international trade flourished. But now, this global economy appears to be crumbling. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a very good example of this. Russia challenged the Western influence in Ukraine by starting an illegal invasion. As a result, the world became a lot less stable and the global economy suffered. With China's increasingly aggressive stance regarding Taiwan, the US-led world order is also being challenged. Chinese and American interests regarding Taiwan are completely opposite, and China is showing no signs of backing off. In the scenario that this situation escalates, boy oh boy, we will definitely see the globalized economy crumble. Right now, the world is dependent on Taiwanese chips, which could turn out to be disastrous. And it's not only US enemies that make globalism difficult to execute. Its allies are also giving it a hard time. For example, the European Union is not blindly following US policy anymore. Macron has repeatedly said that he doesn't want to be a vassal for the US, and that he rather wants the EU to form an independent strategic bloc. Even US allies don't accept an American-led world order anymore. From all of these geopolitical developments, we can conclude that the United States' dominance is being challenged from multiple sides. So what on earth does this have to do with Mexico? Well, a lot, actually. With the US no longer leading the world order, the old version of globalism isn't viable anymore. Consider this. American chip manufacturers used to move their factories to other countries. Now, Biden is paying billions of dollars for them to come back. Nowadays, world leaders prefer to have a secure and robust economy at home above all the benefits globalization can offer. This is because globalism can't be safeguarded by a dominant power like the United States anymore. As a result of the crumbling world order, international relations aren't as stable as they used to be. Think about Russia or China, for example. Because of these significant changes, countries want to reduce their dependency on each other. By moving chip manufacturing to the US, Biden effectively reduces the dependency on Taiwan and China. If this trend continues, globalism is over. But Mexico might be the rare exemption to this. The United States doesn't mind being dependent on Mexico because the two are neighbors. While the globalized economy is in decay, stronger regional economies might be the solution. Regional economies are basically a watered-down version of globalism. Regional economies can have greater security and stability, but they still have some of the benefits globalism can offer. This includes things like bilateral trade with other nations and economies of scale. Therefore, an improved relationship between the US and Mexico can be vital for the future, because it can create a strong regional economy. As globalism appears to be ending, countries will need to focus on their regional economies. Especially in North America, a stronger regional economy will provide a lot of opportunities in and of itself. You could even argue that this regional economy can outperform the former globalized economy in a lot of ways. Getting goods from Mexico to the US is simply a lot faster and a lot cheaper than importing it from China. From Mexico to the US, you can transport goods via trucks, trains, or ships within a few days. When you're importing from China to the US, however, it can take multiple weeks if you have bad luck. As we've already discussed, Mexico simply has a cheaper labor force, which makes for a greater manufacturing opportunity. On top of that, Mexico doesn't face the same labor shortages as its Chinese counterpart. The tariffs for trade between Mexico and the US are also significantly lower. For trade coming from most countries, the United States asks tariffs as a form of taxation on imports. But due to the USMCA agreement, import tariffs between the US, Canada, and Mexico are minimal or even non-existent. For a lot of products, you don't have to pay an import tax when you're trading between these three countries. This is yet another benefit of a stronger regional economy. Mexico can become a powerful manufacturing hub for the United States, and the opportunities don't only stay at manufacturing. Mexico also has a highly educated workforce. Fun fact, Mexico graduates more engineers annually than the United States. This means that not only manufacturing companies, but also technology firms can grab the opportunity to outsource to Mexico. This is great news for Mexico, but also for the United States. Right now, the US is facing a critical shortage of engineers, ranging in the millions of job offers. When you look at their respective economies, Mexico and the United States complement each other pretty perfectly. The United States needs both cheap and skilled labor and a reliable trading partner, and Mexico needs jobs and companies to boost their economy. All the more reason to start a strong regional economy. Conventional wisdom would say that a good neighbor is better than a far-flung friend, which definitely applies to the US and Mexico. Sadly enough, the political reality isn't as promising. The United States and Mexico have had their issues, so to say. Illegal immigration coming from Mexico is one of the biggest political issues in America, with more than 2 million border encounters in the fiscal year of 2022 alone. Most of the migrants don't come from Mexico, however, but from other Latin American countries like Honduras and El Salvador. The reason for this mass migration is poverty and crime that many of the failed states in Latin America have failed to solve. Many Latin Americans think that they'll have a better chance in the United States, being the more stable and prosperous country in the continent. But a lot of Americans fear that mass immigration will cause problems at home, especially the Republican side of the debate. That's why Donald Trump tried to build a wall on the border to prevent migrants from illegally coming into the country. The unwanted side effect of this policy was a strained political relationship between the United States and Mexico. There was a lot of political back and forth on the necessity and the unwanted effects of the wall. Donald Trump blamed the Mexican government for not doing enough about the illegal migration issue. In turn, the Mexican government blamed him for worsening their mutual relation with the wall. Building a wall isn't good for bilateral trade, as it slows down imports and exports coming from both sides. The strained relationship isn't only to be blamed on the illegal migration, though. The high crime rate in Mexico, along with its infamous cartel violence, also causes political concern. The Mexican government doesn't have full control over its own country, because organized crime groups have become way too powerful. The most powerful cartels in Mexico have military-grade weapons and equipment, and through corruption, they also have a large political say in the country. The United States doesn't like this, because these cartels bring illegal drugs into the country with the risk of spreading violence. The ongoing fentanyl crisis has caused thousands of American deaths, and it's directly related to the cartels in Mexico who import contaminated drugs. Some politicians call for the US military to intervene in Mexico to address the issue of the cartels. The Mexican president, López Obrador, doesn't like this. He wants to solve the organized crime issue on his own and preserve his country's sovereignty. He even made the false claim that none of the fentanyl was being produced in Mexico, and that it was all America's own problem. Right now, the drug war cooperation between the United States and Mexico is at its lowest point in decades. Law enforcement from both sides are barely cooperating to solve their mutual problem. So, the issue of organized crime is also something separating the United States and Mexico. But increasing economic ties might be the way out. One of the reasons for illegal migration and organized crime is poverty, which is related to economic underdevelopment. Therefore, when Mexico gets more prosperity, it will theoretically have lower crime rates and less migration. The Mexican government will also have more money to fight issues like organized crime and illegal migration. When bilateral trade grows, Mexico's economy will be on the rise, and these issues can be resolved. That's why building a strong regional economy is one of the best ways to improve the strained relationship between the US and Mexico. The political relations are difficult, but they can be resolved once the two countries just start cooperating. We should also look at the politics inside of Mexico. Government policies have a lot of effect on the economic success of a country. And looking in the past decades, the economic growth, it hasn't been great. This chart shows that the Mexican economy hasn't experienced outstanding growth over this time period. The GDP growth rate has been irregular with ups and downs, and they haven't been fantastic in general. In fact, when we compare Mexico's GDP growth with that of the United States, it appears like there has been no economic growth at all. The opportunities for economic growth were certainly there, but the Mexican government has struggled to turn them into reality. Mexico could have been the most successful country in Latin America because it has a great opportunity for manufacturing as it shares a border with the US. But Mexico's economy hasn't outperformed other countries in Latin America in any way. That's because economic success has a lot of preconditions, like large amounts of foreign direct investment and an improved business environment. First of all, Mexico lacks infrastructure and sufficient public utilities to achieve economic success. The root cause of this problem is the lack of government taxes to fund public infrastructure projects. The government only invests 1.3% of its GDP into these projects, which is a very small amount compared to many other countries. Now, this problem could be relatively easily solved by attracting foreign direct investment. The private sector would love to invest in Mexico because of the growth opportunity ahead. With increased foreign investments, the infrastructure problem could be solved. However, Mexico doesn't attract that much capital. Foreign direct investment inflows account for only 2.6% of its GDP, which isn't a crazy high number. This is definitely not enough to solve the infrastructure problem that Mexico is currently facing. However, with more and more companies moving to Mexico for manufacturing, this foreign investment inflow will surely increase. But even with the odds in its favor, the government in Mexico is still struggling to get more companies to invest in the country. Some of the government policies are causing this deficiency. For example, in 2022, the Mexican president tried to let the government take over the energy sector, which was defeated in Congress. This move has scared multiple private energy companies, which could have invested in Mexico's underdeveloped energy infrastructure. This is just one of the many examples of government policies that scare away foreign investments coming from the private sector. President López Obrador focuses on state-led growth, which decreases the impact companies can have in Mexico. This isn't helpful with achieving economic growth, because the huge opportunities for Mexican growth lie in the private sector. The business environment is also a reason for the lack of economic success. The Mexican government tries to give businesses all kinds of incentives in order to spark economic growth. This is the case with the maquila factories near the US-Mexico border, which have received multiple benefits from the government. These factories manufacture goods for American companies just south of the border, and they don't have to pay taxes or import duties to the Mexican government. The Mexican government has also created various special economic zones to improve the business environment. They provide various benefits to the companies in the economic zones, such as having to pay no income tax for 10 years and no import taxes. In a lot of ways, the business environment is great for large corporations. But the problem is that the rest of the economy just lags behind. Nearly 30% of Mexico's economy is informal, meaning that it's not registered nor taxed by the government. In fact, nearly 60% of Mexicans are employed in this informal sector. This has a huge negative impact, because the government can't collect taxes on this informal economy, and 60% of Mexicans don't enjoy Social Security. One of the reasons for the informal economy is the excessive regulations that make doing business in the formal economy very hard. Paying taxes alone takes Mexican firms 241 hours each year on average, something that small businesses can't afford to do. The huge informal economy is directly one of the reasons for Mexico's sluggish economic growth. Countries with large informal economies generally suffer from low productivity, poor governance, and high inequality. These are things that have dragged Mexico's economy down and have historically caused low growth rates. Mexico might attract a lot of large corporations, but it also has to solve the informal economy in order to grow. Adding on to the complexity of the issues is that the situation varies dramatically per state in Mexico. Looking at the GDP per capita for every state, you can see that there is a huge difference. In some states, the GDP per capita is about $10,000, while in other states, it's $40,000 per capita or even higher. That's 4 times the difference, just on a regional scale. This can be attributed to poor government policies that aren't organizing things well. But it can also be blamed on different policies on a state level. Some states, like Mexico City, Nuevo León, or Baja California, have received relatively high amounts of foreign direct investment as compared to others. This is because some states are just better at attracting businesses than others. These states also have better legislation, solving the problems of the informal economy more efficiently. But to truly achieve economic success in Mexico, every state needs to grow, and the other states shouldn't get left behind. This is something that the country lacks right now. However, all these political issues can be solved eventually. When the country takes an example from successful states like Nuevo León, Mexico could work out a solution to the problems. If the entirety of Mexico manages to attract businesses and to grow its formal economy, an economic boom is inevitable. At least, that's what the governor of Nuevo León predicts. Many problems can be solved when this economic boom happens. For Mexico, it could reduce poverty and the issues related to it. In general, the quality of life will improve and Mexicans will get more prosperous. For the United States, Mexico could turn out to be an invaluable partner, with all the benefits the bilateral trade can offer, such as proximity and reliance. The stronger regional economy in North America will be a serious competitor to China's economy, which has a huge impact on global geopolitics. Talking about China, the CCP has decided between 2 strategies when it comes to this change in Mexico. It can either try to compete with Mexico and fight for its own manufacturing industry, or it can cooperate with Mexico and gain influence within the country. At first glance, Beijing trying to compete with Mexico is a viable option. After all, China's economy is more than 10 times bigger than that of Mexico. China's population is also more than 10 times bigger than Mexico's population. And I know that economic and demographic figures coming from China aren't that reliable, but China certainly has an advantage in size. Mexico won't be able to take over China's manufacturing completely, so China will try to remain competitive on a global level. But when it comes to the US market, well, the story is a little bit different. In the US market, the competition between China and Mexico isn't a story of David and Goliath. In 2021, China exported about $600 billion to the US. In the same year, Mexico exported about $400 billion to its northern neighbor. In the US market, Mexico is a serious competitor to China. Because of the shifting trend in North America, with a stronger regional economy, China stands to lose some serious market share. In this market, it'll be harder for China to compete. That's why the CCP is adopting a different policy: cooperation with Mexico. The CCP doesn't want to lose control over the US export market, because this is one of its biggest strategic advantages. With Mexico increasing its market share, the only way for the CCP to retain this advantage is through getting influence in Mexico. One of the ways to do this is by building infrastructure projects, which the CCP is trying to do in the country. For example, Chinese companies have signed multi-billion-dollar railroad contracts with the Mexican government. This policy of gaining influence through infrastructure projects isn't new for the CCP. However, this traditional way for China to gain influence isn't going to cut it. Mexico is one of the few emerging markets that isn't part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. This is partially because Mexico doesn't want to have too much Chinese investment within its borders. If Mexico would take tons of loans from China, it could upset the United States, their biggest trading partner. But luckily for the CCP, there's another way of getting influence in Mexico, and that's taking over a part of the Mexican economy itself. As of 2022, there were 1,289 Chinese companies investing in Mexico. This includes Chinese car manufacturers like BYD, Changan Motors, or MG Motors. Of course, these are private investments. But in China, companies aren't that independent from the CCP, as they have to follow state policies set by Xi Jinping himself. Through these private investments, the Chinese government is gaining a foothold in the Mexican economy. This could be Beijing's master plan to counter an independent American economy. After all, importing from Chinese companies in Mexico isn't much different than importing out of China itself. And this is bad news for the United States, because it desperately wants to be independent from China. But it's clear that the CCP has a different agenda. To wrap it all up, an economic boom in Mexico seems more than logical. Mexico and the United States could grow their bilateral trade in a move to strengthen the regional economy. Cheap and reliable labor just south of the border is all the US can wish for when it comes to manufacturing. And Mexico, which is still struggling to grow its economy, would love to expand its exports to the biggest economy in the world. Because their interests are aligned, the political differences between Mexico and the United States can be solved. The political situation within Mexico could also improve, with states like Nuevo León leading the way. The question now becomes, will this new alliance make the United States independent from China? The United States hopes to replace Chinese manufacturing with manufacturing coming from Mexico, for economic and political reasons. But the CCP isn't letting this happen, as it's moving hundreds of Chinese companies to the country. One thing is certain though, Mexico is the perfect storm for an economic boom. With all these developments, Mexico could become a manufacturer's paradise. India has launched a war against China. And it's not a war that will be fought on the battlefield. Rather, it's a war that will be fought economically. India has started emerging as the next great powerhouse of Asia in order to counter China's aggression. New Delhi has now positioned itself as an alternative for companies that are getting tired of being used like a pawn in the CCP's grand ambition towards taking over the world. Companies like Apple are already moving to India to set up for a world after China. India has slowly launched its own global projects to counteract China's growing influence from the Belt and Road Initiative. Prime Minister Modi has started India's own lending program for its neighbors in order to stop China from gaining influence by using its debt trap diplomacy. So today, let's go over how India became China's greatest threat.
The head of MI6 last year accused China of using debt traps to gain leverage over countries.
Sri Lanka sought China's financial help. The country took loans worth $45 billion from various countries, including more than $8 billion from China.
An agreement for a $1 billion credit line from India.
The fast patrol vessel will be the fourth ship to be gifted by India to Seychelles.
Pakistan is all set to receive a $700 million loan from China to help it shore its foreign exchange reserves, which are at a 10-year low.
This video took a lot of effort. Recently, my videos have been getting age restricted, which severely hurts their reach with the algorithm, and doesn't really make that much sense. So if you guys can please take a second and hit the like button below, it will help me out a lot. Thank you. So let's start from the beginning. Something that might surprise most of you is the fact that historically, India and China were strong allies and friendly economic partners. The Silk Road linked the cities of Xi'an in China and Pataliputra in India. Trade on the tea and horse road, as the Chinese called it, was a significant factor in the growth of Chinese and Indian civilizations. Coming into modern history, both civilizations had their hands full with their colonizers, as India had the British and China had the Japanese. That didn't stop their leaders from supporting each other. Even under British rule, Indian leaders publicly showed their support for China's struggles against the Japanese. In 1939, future Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, visited China as an honored guest of the government. Both countries actually helped each other in their battles. India helped China against the Japanese and Western imperialism, and in return, China supported India's independence movement against the British. Then, in 1947, India gained its independence from the British Empire. And 2 years later, in 1949, the People's Republic of China, or PRC, came into power in China. This is where the relationship could have soured. Up to this point, Indian leaders had been friendly with the ROC, the Republic of China. When Mao Zedong's PRC came into power, the ROC fled mainland China and took over Taiwan. I'm sure you guys are already familiar with the China-Taiwan issue, so I won't go into it right now. But good relations between the two nations continued, even under new leadership. In fact, India was one of the first countries in the world to recognize the People's Republic of China as the official government of China. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru also became the first foreign leader to visit the PRC in China in 1954, this time to meet with the PRC leader Mao Zedong. Nehru described the visit as the most important foreign mission of his life. He considered India and China to be very similar. He believed as a newly free nation, they couldn't trust the West. They needed to depend on each other to grow their economy and improve living conditions for their citizens. They jointly signed and advocated for the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. But peace, it didn't last long. As soon as the CCP came into power in 1950, they forcibly took over the autonomous region of Tibet by sending loads of military personnel. I have a full video on this story, which was actually demonetized and restricted by YouTube the first time I uploaded it. Good times. I highly recommend you check it out for the full details on this story. But here's a quick recap. After taking over the region in 1950, the CCP slowly kept increasing its military presence in Tibet. As you can imagine, this really pissed off the local Tibetan population, as the CCP was not giving them their religious and cultural freedom. Chairman Mao wanted Tibet to be a Chinese territory. It didn't matter to him that the people there had their own culture and history. So in 1958, a rebellion broke out in Tibet against CCP forces. Tibetans wanted to kick out the CCP and take back their land. But Mao decided to send in even more forces to reassert his dominance. Local Tibetan rebels stood no chance against the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, who had a numbers advantage and experience on their side. India was closely following this clampdown. India had always had a friendly relationship with Tibet, including an economic relationship where North India would freely trade with Tibet. Indian leaders decided not to get involved in this fight, as to not cause a war with their neighbor. Mao, on the other hand, did not share the same feelings about keeping the peace. Declassified documents from decades later have shown that Mao was always paranoid that India was colluding with the USA and the Soviets to overthrow Chinese leadership. Looking back, this really doesn't make any sense. The USA and the USSR were in a pretty intense Cold War in the 1960s, and while India was a neutral nation that was friendly with both sides, I highly doubt the USA and the Soviet Union would set aside the Cold War and collude together to overthrow the leadership in China. Anyway, coming back to the Tibet story. In 1959, the Dalai Lama, fearing for his life in Tibet, fled to India, where he was granted asylum. This, of course, didn't please Chairman Mao, as he saw this action as India playing a role in supporting the rebels against the CCP. This in turn made him more aggressive towards India, and Mao decided to show his aggression by encroaching on India's borders. Speaking of borders, there's one point I quickly want to go over that's actually pretty important. In 1914, while India was still under British control, representatives from Britain, China, and Tibet gathered to determine the status of Tibet. China agreed to allow Tibet to be an autonomous region and remain under Chinese control, but they refused to put the promise in a treaty. Britain and Tibet, on the other hand, signed a treaty creating this line called the McMahon Line. India, to this day, accepts the McMahon Line as the official legal border between India and Tibet. The CCP, on the other hand, well, they didn't accept the McMahon Line. And in 1959, they kept pushing the limits at these borders to show their displeasure. This caused both sides to increase their military presence around the border. And then, in August of 1959, the first bloody clash erupted between the two nations. On the west side of the border, Chinese soldiers pushed into Indian territory. Then, a month later, clashes happened on the east border. This is when India learned that China had built a road inside of Indian territory, which has remained a pretty big issue to this day. To settle these issues, China offered India the west side of the border if India agrees to give China more territory on the east side. India, of course, declined this offer, and firefights kept happening for the next few years. Then, in 1962, Chinese soldiers discovered an Indian post in territory that they believed to be under China's borders. This news traveled to Mao, and he saw this as the final straw. Mao decided to send tens of thousands of soldiers in secret to both east and west sides of disputed borders. The People's Liberation Army swiftly launched an attack on both sides, surprising the Indian soldiers who were both outnumbered and inexperienced. The PLA, on the other hand, had plenty of fighting experience from their wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Taiwan. Indian troops suffered a humiliating defeat, and the CCP was able to capture much of Indian territory. The Indian Army tried setting up a counteroffensive by bringing in more soldiers, but Mao was ready for it and squashed it pretty easily. This is when India asked the USA military for help to take back its territory. At this time, the USA was one of the only two countries who had nukes, the second one being the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, this was also one of the few issues that the USA and the Soviets agreed on. They both saw China as the aggressor in this situation. And since China didn't want to experience their own Hiroshima, they decided to withdraw most of their troops from Indian territory. However, the CCP did decide to keep control of a piece of Indian territory here in the Aksai China region, the same area where they had built a road connecting Xiancheng to Lhasa. Remember this, as this is an issue still to this day. Another ideological goal Mao had with this attack was to stop India from aligning with the USA in the Cold War. Mao's thinking was that if he can show India that China is much stronger, India will be afraid to do anything that will piss off China. But this attack kind of caused the exact opposite to happen. India and the US had become even closer, as they both now had a common enemy in China. This war also changed the borders between India and China. Now this is where the problems start. China attacked India, captured territory, and the new unofficial border was basically in Indian territory. In 1967, another war broke out, and this time India was able to push back some of the Chinese soldiers and regained some of its territories. This changed what China controlled in terms of territory versus what China believed to be its territory. China believes that everything claimed in 1962 is a part of China, but it lost some of that in 1967. India still honors the McMahon Line agreement and believes that China is still illegally occupying Indian territory. This is the reason behind a lot of subsequent clashes that have happened here. Both countries have soldiers patrolling the area, and both countries have different definitions of where their borders end. I mean, you can tell why this is a recipe for clashes, right? Luckily, both countries realize that. But China refused to come to a peaceful agreement about the border dispute. However, they did agree that soldiers from both countries cannot use military weapons against each other, meaning no guns allowed in the 2-mile strip around the supposed line of actual control. These border disagreements are a big reason behind the India-China bitterness towards each other. But the problems don't stop here. As China grew economically, its ambitions on the world stage grew as well. After Mao's passing, Deng Xiaoping opened China up to the rest of the world with his open-door policy. This policy quite literally changed China's economy and its place in the world. It was able to attract foreign businesses to China and quickly transform the country into a manufacturing hub. Millions of people were lifted out of poverty, and China went from a farming nation to the second biggest economy in the world. But as the population started getting older and growth from attracting foreign manufacturing slowed down, the CCP was forced to look elsewhere for future growth. So it decided to feed two birds with one stone. You see, for a nation to be a superpower, for it to be a formidable force on the world stage, it needs to increase its influence with other nations, and it needs to decrease its dependency on its enemies. In short, China needed to get stronger and minimize its weaknesses. Now we skip forward a little bit in our story, because this plan was set in motion by Xi Jinping when he was elected.
Taking the center stage, China's new president and commander-in-chief of the People's Liberation Army, Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping. As votes were counted, there was little surprise.
He got 99.86% of the vote.
China's Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI is a gigantic plan for a global network of ports, roads, railways, and other infrastructure to connect China to the world.
After being elected president, Xi Jinping launched the most ambitious project in history to increase China's influence around the world. China would give out loans to poor, struggling nations in the guise of helping nations that once struggled like they did. But in return, China gained control over countries with valuable resources or in a strategic location. Now you may ask, what if these poor countries can't pay back the loans? Well, China would then get control over important resources like gold, silver, oil, and access. China carefully used loans to gain influence on struggling nations and also choke out its enemies. A prime example being India. If you look at the map of the Belt and Road Initiative, you can clearly see that there's one country that's left out. Not only that, it seems like India is being encircled by this project that is controlled by China. Before we get into how China is doing that exactly, let's first go over why China is doing this. You see, China believes it needs to do this in order to survive. China's economy is very interconnected to the rest of the world, especially to Western countries. Around 1/5 of China's GDP is from its exports, the USA being its biggest export partner, accounting for more than $500 billion or 17% of all of China's exports. The dependency doesn't stop there. If you look at China's top 10 export partners, 9 of them are US allies. More than 50% of China's exports are going to countries that are likely to side with the USA if there's a war. Additionally, China is one of the biggest importers of oil. China imports almost double the amount of oil that the USA does, and the majority of that oil flows from the Middle East, which is transported through the Indian Ocean. All of this oil passes through what some might consider to be one of the most important geopolitical choke points here in the Strait of Malacca. It's projected that 80% of China's oil flows through this strait. This strait is in the territorial waters of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. This strait is a very big weakness for China. In case of any war or political disagreement, this strait could easily be blocked off by enemies like India or the USA. Without access to this route, it's very hard for China to get the energy to fuel its economy, let alone a war. In today's world, oil is the lifeblood of the economy and its government. China's solution to this problem is to build its own alternate route, using the Belt and Road Initiative. China has built pipelines both in Myanmar and Pakistan from the coast to intercity China. It secured long port leases in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Similarly, China has also set up a military base in Djibouti to control Bab el-Mandeb, a vital strait off the coast of Djibouti that links the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Persian Gulf and Asian exports bound for Western markets must first pass through Bab el-Mandeb before reaching the Suez Canal. Between 12.5% and 20% of all global trade passes through this strait. Only 8 miles from China's base is Camp Lemonnier. After seeing all the moves China has been making, a lot of military experts have pointed out that the Belt and Road is not just a geo-economic plan. It also has a military strategic advantage. The ports have increasingly come to play a potentially more menacing role, as dual-use ports that can give the strengthened Chinese Navy a global reach it lacked entirely just a few years ago. These strategic investments are nicknamed the String of Pearls, as the goal is to encircle India and put pressure on New Delhi. India was aware of this already, but the war in Ukraine showed every country in the world how important it is to secure your economic interest. In the modern world, wars can be won and lost before even stepping foot on the battlefield. India realized that, in the case of a war, China's string of pearls can be used as a way to choke off India's access to the world, on top of safeguarding Chinese interests. Adding to this, countries that received Chinese money were slow to criticize China whenever it would start skirmishes on the disputed border with India, like it did in 2017 and 2020. There's also a rumor that China plans to start setting up military bases in countries that received Chinese loans. And of course, this was undoubtedly stressful for New Delhi, as it didn't want to be surrounded by the Chinese military. So, India started laying out its own plan to safeguard its economic interests. But it didn't just stop there. Later in the video, we'll go over how India is taking advantage of China's trade war with the USA to hurt China where it's the strongest, its manufacturing prowess. But first, let's go over how India is countering China's military. To counter the string of pearls, India started its own alliance to encircle China, nicknamed the Necklace of Diamonds. India is expanding its naval bases and is also improving relations with strategically placed countries to counter China's strategies. In 2018, India partnered with Singapore and Indonesia to get access to their naval bases of Changi and Sabang. This increased India's influence and access to the Strait of Malacca, one of the most important choke points for China and the rest of the world in terms of trade. That same year, India also got military access to the port of Duqm in Oman. This port facilitates India's crude imports from the Persian Gulf. In addition to this, the Indian facility is located right between two important Chinese pearls, Djibouti in Africa and Gwadar in Pakistan. India has also signed an agreement with Seychelles for a naval base in the region, which will increase India's presence near the African continent. While doing this, India has also extended credit lines to Iran and agreed to build a port in the country to extend access to trade routes in Central Asia. Additionally, India has extended credit lines in Central Asia to countries like Mongolia, where Modi has agreed to develop a bilateral air corridor. New Delhi has invested a lot in policies to improve relations with Japan and Vietnam. These relations have helped increase Indian trade and, consequently, India's influence on countries around China. But India realized this alone isn't enough. It has also taken big steps towards speeding up its economic growth while taking business away from China. You see, the China-US trade war and COVID provided countries like India with a unique opportunity. Because of economic growth in the past couple of decades, living standards and wages in China have gone up dramatically. This has become an issue for companies that moved to China for their low labor costs. Furthermore, tariffs from the trade war have added even more costs, and the headache of operating in China increased multiple-fold because of Xi's COVID clampdown. This is where companies started looking outwards for their manufacturing needs. For many countries, India provided a perfect solution. India's population is fast-growing, and according to the UN, it's officially now the biggest nation in the world, overtaking China this year. Furthermore, the Indian population is a lot younger when compared to China's aging demographic. The median age in India is 28, a lot younger when compared to China's 38. A big portion of Indian workers speak English. In fact, India has the second largest English-speaking population, only behind the USA. This definitely makes things a lot easier for companies looking to set up shop in India. Certain companies have already noticed these benefits and taken advantage of them. One example of this is Apple, which has already moved some of its iPhone production to the Indian states of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, and is exploring moving its iPad manufacturing to the South Asian nation. JP Morgan analysts even made calculations, and their projections show that 1 in 4 iPhones would be made in India by 2025. India is simply capitalizing on the vulnerabilities that COVID exposed in China. The need for Apple to reduce its dependence on China as a manufacturing center has been clear for many years, but the impact of the pandemic at the world's biggest iPhone assembly plant really underlined the problem. The COVID-19 related disruption was estimated to cost the company $1 billion weekly. It makes sense that Apple wants to avoid this kind of mess again. The Indian government is welcome to deals, as Indian Prime Minister Modi has been working on attracting foreign direct investments since he took office in 2014, sending FDI to a record $83.6 billion in the past fiscal year. With low-cost labor available, low cost of production, and a willing government, it's not hard to see why a good portion of business is leaving China for India. At the current rate, India stands to take a lot of China's business. Because of all this, the UN predicts that India's economy is expected to grow at 6.7% in 2024, compared to the measly 5% expected by China's economy. And it's not just next year. Many organizations forecast that India's economy is expected to grow at a much faster rate for years to come, compared to China's economy. India has already started putting this growth to good use. It's now lending money to neighbors in order to avoid having them indebted to Chinese loans. It has given $8 billion to Bangladesh, $2.1 billion to bail out Sri Lanka after a recent collapse, $1.7 billion to Nepal, $13 billion to the Maldives, and a few more. While India lags far behind China in its overseas lending, New Delhi has stepped up its efforts in recent years, providing tens of billions of dollars in credit to neighboring countries, including financially distressed BRI recipients like Sri Lanka. Indian companies have also expanded rapidly in the region, providing a counterweight to Chinese commercial activity. Indian policymakers see countering BRI as vital to avoid being surrounded by pro-Chinese governments and infrastructure they speculate could one day serve Beijing's military interests. India has definitely stepped up its efforts in containing China. India publicly downplays the competition with China, but its actions show India doesn't want to be held hostage to China's economic or military might. Recently, the first bloody clashes in 45 years took place at the India-China border. But you might not have seen this news because a lot of traditional news organizations are not good at properly covering important geopolitical news. That's why I launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers important geopolitical news in a simplified manner. Every evening, I send out an email directly to your inbox covering important stories that you can read in just a few minutes. Best of all, this is completely free, and you can sign up right now by clicking on the link in the description.
This is a Chinese vessel blinding a Filipino fisherman using lasers in Philippine territory. Earlier, a big Chinese ship purposely collided with a Philippine Coast Guard vessel. It's not just Philippines. China has regularly and aggressively sent fighter jets into Taiwan territory and fired missiles over Taiwanese island. A Chinese warship cut across the bow of an American-guided missile destroyer transiting the Taiwan Strait. China has also sent ships and jets in Malaysia and Indonesian waters to harass the oil drilling operation in both countries' territories. This continuing and growing bullying by China has forced many nations to turn to the USA. In an effort to stop the Chinese advance, the US military has come up with a new strategy. A strategy to surround China and be ready to fight in case there's ever a major escalation. This strategy is the US plan to not only help smaller nations, but also stop CCP from exerting its influence over international waters. So in today's video, let's talk about the US's new strategy to trap China and how it will cement the world order. Before jumping in, we have a quick rant about the state of today's news organizations. News companies are just focused on being divisive and enraging. That's because that's what gets the engagement, which gets more eyeballs, which means more money. We're not gonna lie, regular viewers of the channel know that sometimes we have taken clickbaits a bit too far just to get you guys to watch the video. That's the problem with news that is served by an algorithm. We put tens, if not 100s of hours into making a video, covering important news, but at the end of the day, if we can't convince you to click, all the effort is wasted. This phenomenon is far worse than the news companies, who have special positions just to get clicks on their news. These experts have figured out that the best way to get clicks is to scare the public, focus on negative stories, and blow every event out of proportion. But that's not what news is supposed to be. That's why we launched Global Recaps. Every weekday, an email is sent directly to your inbox. In it, we cover the world's most important news in a short and concise manner, with links to read more if you're interested in any specific news. We also take the most important news story and break it down in simple terms to explain how it affects you and everyone else. These emails take less than 5 minutes to read, and they make you more informed about the world you live in, about the good, the bad, and the neutral. They are meant to keep you informed, not scare you. If you think these emails can be helpful to you, then you can sign up now by scanning the QR code on screen or clicking the link in the description. Now let's get back to the basics. Before jumping into the US's plan, let's quickly go over why China is willing to fight so many countries over the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a marginal sea in the Pacific Ocean bounded by South China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. This region is believed to have around 28 billion barrels of oil reserves, 266 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and holds 1/3 of the entire world's marine biodiversity, thereby making it a very important area for the ecosystem, even if fish stocks in the area are rapidly depleting. If all these weren't reason enough, the South China Sea is a very important trade route, and as of 2019, around 3.37 trillion USD worth of global trade passes through this region annually. The main route to and from the Pacific and Indian Ocean ports is through the Strait of Malacca and the South China Sea. Generally, oil and minerals move north, and food and manufactured goods move south. As we have covered in our previous videos, China is heavily dependent on oil imports to fuel its economy and its industries. Roughly 50% of Chinese oil imports come from the Middle East, and that oil sails through the South China Sea. And as you guys have already heard the last 1,000 times we've said it, China is the world's manufacturing hub, and its economic growth is fueled by selling those manufactured goods to the rest of the world. A big part of China's exports flow through the South China Sea to the rest of the world, so we're sure you guys can see that the South China Sea is very important to China. But does that mean it belongs to China? We're not quite sure. Let's look at China's supposed claim to this area in just a sec. But first, let's go over the international law that defines who controls what part of the ocean. Just a quick reminder to hit the like button to help out the video against the CCP bots. Coming back to the topic, according to the Law of the Sea, that was signed in UN Convention in 1982, each country's sovereign territorial waters extend to a maximum of 12 nautical miles, 22 kilometers, beyond its coast, but foreign vessels are granted the right of innocent passage through this zone. Beyond its territorial waters, every coastal country may establish an exclusive economic zone, EEZ, extending 200 nautical miles, 370 kilometers from shore. Now, remember this, as this will become really important later in the video. Within the EEZ, the coastal state has the right to exploit and regulate fisheries, construct artificial islands and installations, and use the zones for other economic purposes. Now, every country recognizes this law, including China. This is actually how every country has claimed their part of the South China Sea, 200 nautical miles from their coast, every country but China. There are some overlaps in Vietnamese, Malaysian, Brunei's, and Filipino claims, but no one is talking much about that because, well, all these countries are united together against China's claim. You see, when it comes to this part of the sea, China doesn't want to follow the law of the sea. No. In fact, China wants to follow this made-up 9-dash line to exert its claim. This 9-dash line covers almost 90% of the South China Sea, and the CCP claims that it's all part of China. Now, you may ask, what's the reasoning behind the 9-dash line, since there are no laws or anything that mentions this? Well, according to the CCP's reasoning, a Chinese explorer discovered the South China Sea, so therefore, it belongs to China. We guess by the same reasoning, China belongs to Italy because Marco Polo discovered China. Time for CCP to pack up and hand over the reins to the Italians. Jokes aside, that is the reasoning the CCP has used to claim pretty much the whole South China Sea, and it has led to some very confrontational situations with other countries.
Fresh tensions over a long-standing dispute.
A renewed war of words between China and the Philippines today.
We're now being surrounded by Chinese vessels. They've sailed really close to us, as close as a few meters from us.
As territorial disputes in the South China Sea continue.
Aggressive and offensive, the Chinese Coast Guard appears to block the supply boat's path.
I want you to leave this area immediately. Any consequences in telephone match will be borne by you.
To assert their claim, several countries in the conflict officially renamed the region that they claimed. In September 2012, the Philippine president signed an administrative order maintaining that all government agencies use the same West Philippine Sea to refer to the parts of the South China Sea within the Philippines. Similarly, in 2017, Indonesia renamed the northern reaches of its exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea as the North Natuna Sea in an attempt to assert its sovereignty. All while this is happening, the CCP starts building its own island in the South China Sea. Not just any islands, military islands. They were home to few military personnel, an airstrip, and a missile system. Based on international law, these islands were within the Philippines border, so the Philippines decided to take China to UN court. In 2016, a ruling from The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines, claiming China had indeed encroached their land, a ruling that the CCP chose to ignore and is not put into effect yet. To make matters worse, the CCP declared the airspace above the disputed land to be a defensive air identification zone, and issued a notice that aircrafts flying through it would need Chinese permission. This move, while they claim will only be enforced in defense, has further strained relations between the countries. On top of this, there was a second part of this ruling that was just as important to the whole conflict. You guys remember earlier how we said that according to the law of the sea, 200 nautical miles from the coast is each country's exclusive economic zone? Well, so there are a group of islands in the middle of the South China Sea, called the Spratly Islands, that all the countries are trying to claim. The main reason being that if you can establish a claim on the island, you can extend your EEZ and control more of the South China Sea. But according to a 2016 ruling, the Spratly Islands were ruled a rock, so it doesn't extend any country's EEZ. This kind of killed the importance of the islands, but that doesn't mean conflict calmed down. China has been using something called the cabbage strategy, or the salami slicing strategy, to choke out supplies to foreign lands. To accomplish this, China will surround a foreign-controlled islands with its ships and destroyers to deny access to rival nations, and then try to subsequently claim the islands. Now, of course, the United States has a lot of allies in this conflict, and we have the strongest navy in the world. One important part that the US Navy plays is maintaining peace at sea, so world trade can continue without interruption. So since China was being so aggressive in the South China Sea, the US Navy has increased its presence there to keep peace. This is where the new US military plan starts. In fact, this was a plan that started soon after the end of World War II. To counter the Soviet Union and Communist China's maritime ambitions, the United States crafted the island chain strategy. As the Soviet Union collapsed and Communist China grew, a similar strategy has been used to contain China. 2 island chains in the Western Pacific are noteworthy. The first comprises the Kuril Islands, the main Japanese archipelago, Okinawa, the northern part of the Philippine archipelagos, the Malay Peninsula, and Taiwan. The second chain consists of the islands of Japan stretching to Guam and the islands of Micronesia. America was able to set up bases or form partnerships with countries to solve its biggest hurdle. The US military had a problem in the Western Pacific, the tyranny of distance and time. Delivering military force across the vast Pacific Ocean has never been easy, even for a country as blessed in resources and ingenuity as the United States. If the Chinese army were to launch a rapid attack, it would be able to move a lot faster than the American Navy could respond if it weren't for the island chain. American forces located outside the conflict area would have to penetrate China's anti-access area denial A2AD network to restore the status quo that was there beforehand. A daunting proposition. Under these circumstances, Washington might face the unenviable choice of doing nothing or escalating to higher levels of violence. Either way, the national interests of both the United States and its closest allies would suffer dramatically. This is where the first island chain strategy was very helpful in stationing American troops and weapons near the possible battle zone. The main goal of being so close to China is twofold. First, by being ready to defend the area from Chinese aggression, the USA strategic forces are hoping to deter China from launching an assault in the first place. But this strategy only holds true as long as China believes that the US Navy can defeat it. History shows that deterrence is more likely to fail when an aggressor believes it can pull off an attack successfully. If Chinese leadership believes it can achieve gains through aggression quickly and without paying steep costs in blood, money, and reputation, it may be tempted to escalate a crisis to open conflict. This is where island chains are not only set up as a way to support allies, but also as a way to blockade the Chinese inside in case of an assault. As covered earlier, China is a big importer of oil. In fact, China imports almost double the amount of oil that the USA does, and the majority of that oil flows from the Middle East, which is transported through the Indian Ocean. All this oil passes through what some might consider one of the most important geopolitical choke points, here in the Strait of Malacca. It's projected that 80% of China's oil flows through this strait. This strait is the territorial waters of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. This strait is a very big weakness for China. In case of any war or political disagreement, this strait could easily be blocked off by enemies like India or the USA. Without access to this route, it's very hard for China to get energy to fuel its economy, let alone a war. In today's world, oil is the lifeblood of the economy and its government. The CCP can only survive for so many days with a mostly halted economy. That's why, as China's economy grew, the CCP became more aware of its shortcomings and invested heavily in improving its military and navy to avoid getting in the situation where another country controlled the sea routes that China depended on. CCP realized that to become the dominant power in Asia, China must first become the preeminent power in the first island chain. According to the U.S. Department of Defense's Military and Security Developments Involving the People's Republic of China 2019 report, China has been establishing communication, aviation and port facilities, fixed weapon positions, and barracks in the Spratly Islands since 2018. Developing a strong and permanent military presence in the first island chain will give China control of the major shipping routes in Asia and help in establishing itself as a dominant global power. The Chinese Coast Guard, CCG, frequently harasses fishing and survey vessels of other claimant states in the South China Sea. In 2020, a Chinese warship laser-tagged a Philippine Navy ship. A Chinese survey vessel, Haiyang DZ-8, illegally entered Malaysia's maritime exclusive economic zone and tailed a Malaysian state-owned oil company's contracted ship. On the 22nd of May 2020, Beijing announced an $178.2 billion military budget, an increase of 6.6% from 2019. Also in May, the CCG harassed Japanese fishing vessels in the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. The militarization of contested islands and harassment of foreign vessels from Diaoyu Senkaku down to the Malay Peninsula exposes China's intention and strategy to control the first island chain. On top of overpowering the first island chain, CCP is also trying to build infrastructure and the world to overcome this obstacle. Many experts have pointed out that CCP's flagship belt and road initiative is a way of making sure that China has reduced its dependency on the Pacific Ocean routes. China has built pipelines both in Myanmar and Pakistan, from the coast to inner-city China. It secured long port leases in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Similarly, China has also set up a military base in Djibouti to control Bab el-Mandeb, a vital strait off the coast of Djibouti that links the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Persian Gulf and Asian exports bound for Western markets must first pass through Bab el-Mandeb before reaching the Suez Canal. Between 12.5% and 20% of all global trade passes through this strait. Only 8 miles from China's base is Camp Lemonnier. As China got stronger, it made moves to set itself free of the island chain. This left many Pacific Ocean countries worried that China is preparing for increased aggression and bullying near Taiwan and South China Sea. It's not just the first island chain that China is targeting, it's also building up strength to overcome the second island chain in the middle of the Pacific. Just a reminder, the second chain consists of the islands of Japan stretching to Guam and the islands of Micronesia. China's presence in the second island chain would give Beijing control of the middle of the Pacific, which serves as a strategic military and economic outpost. The U.S.'s withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017 has emboldened China to fill the vacuum of influence in the Western Pacific. In September 2019, China's economic support for the Solomon Islands led the Pacific state to switch its diplomatic recognition of Taiwan to China. Soon after, Kiribati followed suit. In December 2019, China vowed to provide economic assistance for infrastructure development to Micronesia. Notably, Micronesia could serve as a strategic location for China to counter American military presence in Guam. However, the U.S. has agreements with Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands, the Compacts of Free Association, which gives the U.S. exclusive access to the land, sea, and air routes of these island states. Although China courts the Pacific Islands with promises of economic investments, they are still traditionally tied to the U.S. This fact adds difficulty for China, as a military presence without a strategic basing to penetrate the second island chain will be hard to achieve. But coming back to the South China Sea, China's actions have left the USA with two choices: either strengthen the first island chain to gain back the advantage in deterrent strategy, or ditch protecting American allies in the Pacific Ocean. So obviously, America has stepped its efforts to reinforce the first island chain to safeguard its allies' interests. Just this year, the U.S. Marine Corps marked the opening of a new base on America's westernmost Pacific island, Guam. This will be the first new Marine base since 1952 and will house 5,000 Marines charged in the short term with deterring and detecting threats in the region. Longer term, the Guam base, almost equidistant from Japan and Taiwan, is also stated to be a hub for Marines on Guam and across the northern Mariana Islands to train for protecting Pacific Islands, including vital sea lanes, in the event of an invasion. If there is a conflict with China, the Marines would be among the first ground forces to respond. Around the same time, the USA reached an agreement with the Philippines that gives the US access to 4 military camps in the country. Even though this doesn't give US military permanent bases there, it does give US troops, rotating in and out of the Philippines, a bird's-eye view of 2 critical spots: the Taiwan Strait and disputed regions of the South China Sea. There are about 500 US troops in the Philippines on any given day, but thousands rotate in and out over the course of a year for military exercises, humanitarian aid, training, and other missions, according to officials. The Philippines allow American forces to stay in barracks within designated Philippine camps. The US already had access to 5 Philippine military bases. On top of this, the US would also increase its deployment of advanced military assets to the Korean Peninsula, including fighter jets and aircraft carriers to boost joint training and planning. Additionally, US and Japan agreed to adjust the American troop presence on the island of Okinawa, in part to enhance anti-ship capabilities that would be needed in the event of a Chinese incursion into Taiwan or other hostile acts in the South or East China Sea. They also added a formal mention of outer space in the long-standing US-Japan Security Treaty, making clear that attacks to, from, and within space could trigger the mutual defense provisions of the treaty. And Japan announced it would begin constructing a pair of runways on the small southern island of Mangashima, where joint exercises, amphibious operations, and missile interception could begin in about 4 years. The island would be a hub for troop deployments and munition supplies in case of a conflict like a Taiwan emergency. The changes in the US deployment on Okinawa will transform the 12th Marine Regiment into a smaller, more rapidly mobile unit, the 12th Marine Littoral Regiment, which will be better equipped to fight an adversary and defend the US and its allies in the region. The US is doing everything in its power to send the signal that if there's any aggression near the South China Sea, it will be far more of a guaranteed win for China. Goal of all this is deterrence by denial. The US has also been busy diplomatically. The US opened an embassy in the Solomon Islands this year in a direct effort to counter China's growing influence there. There had been an embassy in the Solomons for several years, but it was closed in 1993 as part of a global reduction in diplomatic posts. Over time, however, the US became concerned about possible weakening ties with the country. The Solomon Islands switched allegiance from the self-ruled island of Taiwan to Beijing in 2019, and last year, the Solomons signed a security pact with China, raising fears of a military buildup by Beijing in the region. Reopening an embassy there, the US State Department said, was a priority to counter China's growing influence in the region. The embassy in the capital, Honiara, is starting small, with a charge d'affaires, a couple of State Department staff, and a handful of local employees. Just to add insult to injury, India has also started its strategy to encircle China and contain China's growing influence. After seeing all the moves China has been making, a lot of military experts have pointed out that the Belt and Road is not just a geoeconomic plan, it also has a military strategic advantage. The ports have increasingly come to play a potentially more menacing role as dual-use ports that can give the strengthened Chinese Navy a global reach it lacked entirely just a few years ago. These strategic investments are nicknamed the String of Pearls, as the goal is to encircle India and put pressure on New Delhi. India was aware of this already, but the war in Ukraine showed every country in the world how important it is to secure your economic interests. In the modern world, wars can be won and lost before even stepping a foot on the battlefield. India realized that, in the case of a war, China's String of Pearls can be used as a way to choke off India's access to the world, on top of safeguarding Chinese interests. Adding to this, countries that received Chinese money were slow to criticize China whenever it would start skirmishes on the disputed border with India like it did in 2017 and 2020. There's also a rumor that China plans to start setting up military bases in countries that received Chinese loans, and of course this was undoubtedly stressful for New Delhi, as it didn't want to be surrounded by the Chinese military. So India started laying out its own plan to safeguard its economic interests, but it didn't just stop there. Later in the video, we will go over how India is taking advantage of China's trade war with the USA to hurt China where it's the strongest, its manufacturing prowess. But first, let's go over how India is countering China's military. To counter the String of Pearls, India started its own alliances to encircle China, nicknamed the Necklace of Diamonds. India is expanding its naval bases and is also improving relations with strategically placed countries to counter China's strategies. In 2018, India partnered with Singapore and Indonesia to get access to their naval bases of Changi and Sabang. This increased India's influence and access to the Strait of Malacca, one of the most important choke points for China and the rest of the world in terms of trade. That same year, India also got military access to the port of Duqm in Oman. The port facilitates India's crude imports from the Persian Gulf. In addition to this, the Indian facility is located right between two important Chinese pearls, Djibouti in Africa and Gwadar in Pakistan. India has also signed an agreement with Seychelles for a naval base in the region, which will increase India's presence near the African continent. While doing this, India has also extended credit lines to Iran and agreed to build a port in the country to extend access to trade routes in Central Asia. Additionally, India has extended credit lines in Central Asia to countries like Mongolia, where Modi has agreed to develop a bilateral air corridor. New Delhi has invested a lot in policies to improve relationships with Japan and Vietnam. These relationships have helped increase Indian trade and consequently India's influence on countries around China. China's hegemony, not only in Asia, but in the world, is ending. A lot of factors like the COVID pandemic and the Chinese Communist Party's own hostile foreign policies have contributed to the mix of the decline of the Chinese empire. One nation, however, has emerged as a beneficiary of China's woes and an accelerator of China's problems, rising to glory in the wake of China's burning ashes. That nation is none other than the Asian country of Vietnam.
Vietnam is emerging as a low-cost alternative to China.
The opportunity in Vietnam is huge.
Since November 2022, we see a huge amount of foreign investors coming back to the market.
With a plentiful workforce, the government opened its doors to high-tech companies, looking to bring them from China, where a worker's average salary is 3 times that of Vietnam.
When you consider the rating which Vietnam is on, it's a very attractive market for the long term.
Vietnam, which is one of 12 nations in the pact, is positioned to hugely benefit economically. The agreement could also loosen Vietnamese ties with China.
The world is now abandoning China as companies like Nike, Adidas, and Samsung are choosing Vietnam over China. It legitimately seems like China's day in the sun is over, and Vietnam's glory days are just beginning. In today's video, we will be going over exactly why this is happening and how Vietnam is checkmating China. We will discuss Vietnam's rise to power and the factors that have given it an edge over China in recent years. Lastly, we will discuss China's role in all of this, and if truly the Great Dragon of the East is down for the count, or if the world's media is rushing to make an early verdict on a battle that still has life in it. So without taking much time, let's get into it. As we do that, please take a second to like this video and drop a comment on the next topic you'd like us to cover. By liking the video, you can help push the ever-hostile YouTube algorithm in our favor. These videos take time and effort to make, so your response as a community means a lot to us, something we're grateful for. Okay? Now let's get to talking about Vietnam. We know some of you might be surprised to hear that Vietnam is well on its way to becoming a global economic giant, but to be fair, this was a long time coming. Vietnam has always been living in the shadows of other Asian nations like China and India, but that's not to say it hasn't been, if not more progressive with its economy. In the past 30 years alone, the nation has undergone a transformation, and poverty reduction has played a fundamental role in bringing the nation to where it is today. As reported by the World Bank, the poverty headcount in Vietnam fell from nearly 60% to 20.7% in the past 20 years. That is miraculous growth if nothing else. From within the shadows, it seems like Vietnam has quietly transitioned from being one of the poorest global economies to one of the fastest growing with room for even more growth. Let's trace this progress path now, shall we? Most people, especially here in the United States, are only familiar with Vietnam because of the Vietnam War that went on from 1954 to 1975. The war was a long, drawn-out conflict that pitted the communist government of North Vietnam and its allies in South Vietnam, known as the Viet Cong, against the government of South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The war ended up being a proxy war between Russia and the US in what was almost an idealistic war, a battleground for the Cold War. Most Americans will remember it as a costly affair that showed the fighting spirit of the Vietnamese people, even against a superior power. Well, after the US military retreated from Vietnam in 1975, the country's economy experienced severe developmental issues, resulting from the inefficiencies of a centrally planned economy, residual war effects, and low productivity rates that made it import dependent. These issues stifled growth, making the Asian nations suffer economically on top of all the instability that came with decades of post-war fever. To add to that boiling mess of hot Cheetos, Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia in 1979 to remove the Khmer Rouge government complicated the economic woes the country was already suffering from by redirecting resources to the war effort. These are resources that the struggling nation could have used for its people, but no, they were being used to fund yet another war. As a result of this, Vietnam faced the wrath of the international community, which condemned such actions. In fact, the US went as far as to impose sanctions, a situation that only served to further collapse the Asian nation. All these economic deficiencies and global tensions resulted in Vietnam's economy being one of the poorest in Asia, with a GDP growth rate of 2.8% in 1985 and a 378% inflation rate in 1986. One could say that reaching this bottom barrel of poverty is what inspired change to come. This is because in 1986, the Vietnamese Communist Party, or VCP as we'll be referring to it, set out to transform its economy. We suppose they woke up one day and decided that enough was enough and that it was time for a change. The VCP then shifted the economy from a centrally planned model to one that utilized market forces to allocate resources. The reforms, popularly known as Deux Moi, encouraged private industry, recognized private land rights, and abolished collective farming. The main thrust of the Deux Moi was to promote a multi-sector economic system, emphasizing the state sector while encouraging the private sector. To achieve economic integration, the open door would be implemented gradually in order to stabilize the political and social situation. Deux Moi, in its early stages, was focused mainly on the removal of self-imposed barriers to progress and the utilization of various market-oriented measures, including liberalization of the domestic market, encouragement of foreign district investment and the private sector, and reduction in subsidies to state-owned enterprises. These changes, along with Vietnam's military withdrawal from Cambodia in 1989, set the country on a course toward one of the quickest and most impressive periods of economic development in world history, an achievement whose successes we are discussing now. In 1986, when the VCP first implemented these reforms, Vietnam was one of the poorest countries in the region, with a poverty rate above 70%. That means that over 70% of the nation's citizens were living in abject poverty. That's 1 in every 10 people. That is quite the number. However, by 2020, this rate had declined to 5%, as in 0.5 people for every 10. That is quite an improvement. Also, as a result of the reforms, Vietnam went from a country faced with perpetual food shortages to in 1989, for the first time, exporting 1.4 million tons of rice. It has since remained a rice exporter. In 2008, it exported 4.7 million tons, becoming the world's second largest rice exporter after Thailand. Indeed, Vietnam's exports were instrumental in stemming the threat of a severe international food crisis in early 2008. Vietnam hasn't looked back since, with it in 2022 being the third top rice exporter in the world. It's very clear to see that the VCP's reforms have had such an impact on the nation. Looking at the numbers, you can see that in the 2010s alone, over 10 million people were rescued from the jaws of poverty by these VCP reforms. In less than a 30-year period as well, the country's GDP per capita also increased nearly tenfold, from under $300 in the 1980s to $2,800 in 2020. Let's be honest, if the world was a classroom, Vietnam would definitely be getting the prize for the most improved student. A lot of factors over the years have contributed to Vietnam becoming what it is today, and all this has led to the nation becoming one of the best investment places of the new age. The small nation has become a key part of the global supply chain, for textiles becoming an alternative, in some cases a better one to nations like China and India. The manufacturing capabilities of Vietnam have been so great that footwear and textiles made up 18% of its exports in 2018, while electronics and electrical equipment made up 40%. This number has only risen, getting higher and higher over the years. As this number has risen, so has Vietnam's relevancy so far as manufacturing is involved. This relevancy has been so much so that major companies like Adidas, Nike, and Samsung, among many others, now have a manufacturing presence there. As a result of this, it is no surprise that Vietnam's foreign direct investment has grown over 200 times since 1986, from $40,000 in 1986 to around $15.8 billion in 2018. Meanwhile, its exports increased by 19% from 2020 to 2021 and have only grown higher to date. Vietnam's growth in the region is now directly affecting and competing with China, the world's current biggest manufacturing hub. Vietnam has been growing at a steady pace and in silence, with its own economic growth eclipsing China in relation to its own economy. That means that even though China still outpaces Vietnam by far, Vietnam's growth rate has been higher than China's and higher than any Asian nation overall. Take a look at this table of growth projections in Asia. Vietnam leads the pack while China's own growth is slowing down. There almost seems to be a direct inverse correlation to the success of Vietnam and the misfortunes of China. It seems that as China slows down and loses out on growth, Vietnam is growing and developing more. Is there a direct relation? Well, we think yes and no. Let us explain. Firstly, the yes part. An undeniable fact of the matter is that part of Vietnam's growth, a huge part of it, is due to the great power competition between the United States and China.
The rising tensions between the world's two most powerful countries, the United States and China.
Game on here. A trade war between the United States and China is here. It's real. At the stroke of midnight, the U.S. hit China with tariffs on $34 billion worth of goods.
A battle between China and the U.S. over the self-governing island nation could result in devastating mutual losses.
So we don't have trade, which we don't have anything near free trade with China. We've opened up our markets to the Chinese for 25 years. This is my point.
Tensions between China and the United States, as I mentioned, are running high. Their defense chiefs are in a war of words.
It's China's fault. And you know what? It's not Joe's fault that it came here either. It's China's fault.
You see, in the past couple of years, as the tension between the United States and China has grown, the Chinese Communist Party has taken a less business-friendly posture. American businesses operating within China have found themselves on the short end of the stick as they have faced tons of retaliatory measures from the Chinese government, almost as a punishment for the US government hostilities. Let us give you a simple example. After Micron, an American tech company, rebuffed a 2015 takeover attempt by a Chinese state-owned company, it watched with disbelief as its innovations were stolen and copied by a Chinese competitor, and its business was blocked from China. It is China's treatment of American companies like Micron that contributed to former US President Donald Trump's decision to unleash a punishing trade war with the world's second-largest economy, a fight he said would halt Beijing's use of unfair practices to undermine the United States. Another example is the Marriott Hotel incident, an incident that shows that China has and will retaliate against companies it is displeased with. After Marriott had referred to Taiwan as a separate country on its website, the Beijing government shut down its online reservation site in China for a week. The company then had to issue an apology in an attempt to rectify the matter. The chief executive, Arne Sorensen, wrote in a statement on the company's website saying, "Marriott International respects and supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of China. We don't support anyone who subverts the sovereignty and territorial integrity of China, and we do not intend in any way to encourage or incite any such people or groups. We recognize the severity of the situation and sincerely apologize." These are all examples of how the Chinese government could easily and has been making life difficult for American companies. Things like slowing down the permitting process for new stores or imposing stiff fines for minor infractions have not been known to be foreign. Add to the mixture the harsh zero-COVID policies that China has been putting into place, and what we have left is nothing short of a horrible business environment for most companies, particularly US ones. This has left companies feeling limited, insecure, and seeking alternative supply chains in a bid to reduce risk if and when any disruptions occur. Perhaps it is no wonder then that in 2021 alone, more than 11,000 foreign firms canceled their company registration in China. That's a big number. Others like Apple, Samsung, and Hasbro, which have had significant and long-standing manufacturing operations in China, have decided to reduce their operations in the country. And you know who they turn to in all of this? Sweet, reliable Vietnam. All this makes us think that Vietnam is the sweet best friend who capitalizes when a toxic couple breaks up and then ends up getting the girl. You know, your typical rom-com plot. In this case, Vietnam got the US, or rather a good portion of the business that the US was giving China. Vietnam has really benefited as major companies have moved their manufacturing there to take advantage of the low costs, developed infrastructure, supportive business environment, and success in mitigating the economic effects of COVID-19. For instance, Foxconn, the prominent electronic manufacturer that contracts with all major technology companies, including the behemoth Apple, announced it would invest $300 million in a new factory in northern Vietnam. Another giant, Google, has announced recently that it plans to ship as much as half of the production of its Pixel phones to Vietnam, while Microsoft has utilized Vietnam for some of its Xbox production. A few years ago, these corporations would have exclusively produced these items in China, but now, Vietnam is getting a big piece of the cake. The fact that these companies are also investing in factories and the like in Vietnam means that this is not a fad, but a long-term commitment that will only serve to benefit Vietnam more as the years progress. The Asian nation's growth, however, had not just been due to the US-China trade deficiencies. There have been other pull factors that have made Vietnam an attractive choice. Let's get into those, shall we?
Smartphones and other gadgets are manufactured in China these days. But what about Vietnam?
Vietnam's economy jumped by 8% this year.
The PVHs, even the Adidases and the Columbia sportswears, they've all sourced product out of Vietnam, and they have been doing that for years.
It's emerging as an alternative to China with its tax incentives and cheaper workforce.
The U.S. is importing 40% more from Vietnam than this time last year, while imports from China down 13%.
Okay, we've warmed you up on the successes of Vietnam. So we know you're asking yourself now, saying, how did this growth miracle happen? Other than the opportunistic approach it took with the US-China trade war, Vietnam has had other factors accelerate its growth. Analysts from the World Bank think that the nation's entire growth can be condensed together into three main factors we're about to dive into right now. The first of these factors is the simple fact that due to the VCP's policies, Vietnam has thoroughly embraced trade liberalization with gusto, with 95% of Vietnamese people agreeing to say that trade is good in a 2014 Pew Research survey. It makes sense that the people think so, because trade and globalization have been incredibly good for the nation. Vietnam's exceptionally globalized economy is a result of its focus on exports for economic growth. Over the past 20 years, Vietnam has signed numerous free trade agreements in order to become a contender on the global stage. In 1995, Vietnam joined the ASEAN Free Trade Area. In 2000, it signed a free trade agreement with the US, and in 2007, it joined the World Trade Organization. Since then, further ASEAN agreements followed with China, India, Japan, and Korea, and recently the amended Trans-Pacific Partnership went into effect. These agreements were made with the hope of gradually lowering the tariffs imposed on both imports and exports to and from Vietnam, thereby making it more trade-friendly, and making the trading itself cheaper to do. Suffice it to say, this has worked out quite well. Like China before it, Vietnam has opened up its cheap labor market to foreign investors and become a hub for low-cost manufacturing. The country is now a major exporter of electronics and apparel, with the United States and China as the main destinations for its goods. In order to make those goods, Vietnam is a major importer of machine parts and natural resources from South Korea and China. All of this has seen Vietnam's GDP per person grow from about $1,500 in 1990 to about $6,500 today. Quite the significant rise if we do say so ourselves. Also, unlike in some fast-growing economies, its new prosperity has been shared in the nation. The proportion of people in extreme poverty fell from above 70% in the early 1990s to around 10% in 2016. The World Bank credited the jobs created by Vietnam's export sector for this remarkable poverty reduction in a recent report. Perhaps most importantly, the economic growth was fairly inclusive. According to the World Economic Forum's Inclusive Development Index, Vietnam is part of a group of economies that have done particularly well at making their growth processes more inclusive and sustainable. Women, too, fared better. Their employment rate is within 10% of that of men, notes the World Bank, and women-led households are less likely than those by men to be poor, although inequalities remain. That's the kind of growth that's admirable. Oddly enough, even as Vietnam is checkmating China by taking business from them, data from the General Department of Customs shows that in 2022, China was Vietnam's largest trading partner with a total two-way trade turnover of $175.57 billion. This is a lot of trade being had there. This was followed by the US, who had $123.86 billion, the Republic of Korea, who had $86.38 billion, and Japan, who had $47.61 billion, all worth of trade. Trade between Vietnam and the US has been particularly good, with Vietnam being one of the top 10 largest goods trading partners of the United States. The total two-way trade value of goods in 2020 with the US was $89.5 billion. Goods exports to Vietnam from the US totaled $9.9 billion, while goods imports from Vietnam totaled $79.6 billion. This figure has only risen with time, as in 2021, Vietnam exported $99.3 billion to the United States. The main products exported from Vietnam to the United States were broadcasting equipment $17.4 billion, other furniture $6.23 billion, and seats worth $4.53 billion, among other things. Don't find these objects surprising. It's simply what the US mostly imports from Vietnam. In fact, in the past month, the top 3 US imports from Vietnam, also by value, were cell phones, related equipment, computers, and furniture parts. We had to mention that for those of you who might have been surprised that the US imports furniture and seats. In 2022, the total two-way trade value between the nations was, as we mentioned a second ago, $123.86 billion. We emphasize this to show you just how much these trade figures keep going up as trade between the two nations keeps improving year after year. So yes, we think it is quite safe to say that trade and globalization has been an important tool that Vietnam has managed to use in its favor. The second factor that Vietnam has going for it is that through its own domestic policies and extensive reforms, the nation has managed to put in place business-friendly regulations, all while lowering the cost of doing business in the nation. While trying to make foreign-friendly policy, the government's drive towards an open economy also included domestic reforms that targeted matters of governance from the inside. In 1986, the country created its first law on foreign investment, enabling foreign companies to enter Vietnam. Since then, law firm Baker & McKenzie said in a 2016 report, the law has been revised a number of times, mainly to adopt a more pro-investor approach while aiming to reduce administrative bureaucracy and better facilitate foreign investment into Vietnam. This has worked, seeing as that the foreign direct investment in Vietnam averaged $7.29 billion from 1991 until 2023, reaching an all-time high of $27.72 billion in December of 2022. These were astonishing figures, and of course, they did not go unnoticed in international rankings. In the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, Vietnam rose from 77th place in 2006 to 55th in 2017. In the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business rankings, meanwhile, Vietnam rose from 104th place in 2007 to 68th place in 2017. Last year, the bank said, Vietnam made progress on everything from enforcing contracts, increasing access to credit and electricity, paying taxes, and trading across borders. That's quite an achievement to make, and that is all thanks to Vietnam's own domestic reforms. Finally, the last factor that has contributed to the nation being where it is today is the fact that Vietnam has invested heavily in human and physical capital, predominantly through public investments. The Asian nation has truly invested a lot in its human capital and infrastructure. Facing a rapidly growing population, one that stands at just under 99 million today, half of whom are under 35 and up from 60 million in 1986, Vietnam made large public investments in primary education. This was necessary as a growing population also means a growing need for jobs. In addition to this, Vietnam also invested heavily in infrastructure, ensuring cheap mass access to the internet. This might sound minor, but with the Fourth Industrial Revolution knocking on Southeast Asia's door, having a sound IT infrastructure in place is essential preparation. At the end of the day, looking at Vietnam, one can see that those investments have paid off. Armed with the necessary infrastructure and market-friendly policies in place, Vietnam became a hub for foreign investment and manufacturing in Southeast Asia. Japanese and Korean electronics companies like Samsung, LG, Olympus, Pioneer, and countless European and American apparel makers have set up shop in the country, only serving to increase the nation's economic benefit. In fact, due to the infrastructure and labor investments in the nation, Vietnam is the fourth largest textile exporter in the world. That's quite the achievement for such a small nation. The amount of their exports is estimated to be over $38 billion. Specialization, modernization, and the manufacture of high-quality products are their primary goals to compete in this competitive market, and it definitely is working out for them. The nation's textile industry is made up of the downstream sector, fiber production, and upstream garment manufacturing. Growing garment exports to the United States, Japan, the European Union, and South Korea are a significant component fueling the expansion of Vietnam's textile sector as it keeps growing. It will be no surprise to see Vietnam directly rivaling China in the textiles industry in the years to come, as the company is on what can only be described as an unbelievable growth spurt. These three factors have collectively led Vietnam's GDP growth to increase, with it being at least 5% per year, and just last year, it peaked at a whopping 8%. This is in stark comparison to China, which grew from just 2.99%, its lowest since 1990. Just looking at this graph of Vietnam's GDP growth shows a tale of nothing but progress and increase. With such rapid economic growth over the years, the country has grown from one of the poorest countries in the world to a comfortably middle-income one. So, all this said, is there anything that can stop Vietnam from checkmating China? Despite all the high praise that we carry for Vietnam, the nation still faces severe hurdles to future growth. Perhaps the most important and the most limiting factor to the nation's ability to properly checkmate China is the country's population size. Quite frankly, it will never amount to more than a fraction of China's. You see, Vietnam is slightly less populous than China's southern Guangdong province. The birthplace of Chinese special economic zones in 1979, and still a key component in its manufacturing, Foxconn even had its flagship campus in Guangdong. While Chinese tech giants Huawei and ZTE are headquartered there, these companies are centralized there mainly because of the province's easy access to Hong Kong and coastal ports and access to the Chinese labor pool. Vietnam, on the other hand, has none of the benefits that come with being a province of a vast, economically diversified nation with the world's largest workforce. That's where they start to lag behind. According to a Beijing national census conducted in 2010, around one-third of Guangdong's population of 104 million were migrants from elsewhere in China. While Vietnam's rural population of around 65% certainly leaves room for urban migration to bolster manufacturing, the country lacks China's hundreds of millions of people ready to travel to fill positions as they arise. The factories in the Pearl River Delta churning out iPhones and Nike sneakers can rely on a steady stream of migrants from across China to man the assembly lines, while Vietnam has only itself to turn to. With a small population, what this means is that as the growth intensifies, Vietnam might not be able to keep up with demand based on the simple fact that it will run out of labor. This puts a cap on the level of growth they can experience. In addition to this, in comparison to China, Vietnam's workforce is relatively low-skilled, and its energy supply is having a hard time keeping up with demand. And although the country has made significant advances in infrastructure development, it still ranks 47th out of 160 countries in this regard. That's yet another setback to Vietnam's plan to checkmate China. We know that some of you are asking yourself, other than labor shortfalls, can anything stop Vietnam's ascent to the top of the Asian food chain? Well, just like with most things, yes and no. With the appetite for globalization on the wane in many parts of the country, Vietnam looks particularly vulnerable, and with good reason. Vietnam's exports are worth 99.2% of its GDP. Yes, 99.2%. Just to further clarify that figure, what we're saying is that Vietnam's whole economy is basically based on foreign investment and trade. If anything at all were to hinder supply chain movements, or if the foreign policy of its top trading partners shifted against it, Vietnam would be stuck in some very hot and unpleasant soup. This is a real possibility given how geopolitics and the political economic landscape are always shifting. However, for now, Vietnam looks to profit from rather than be hurt by increasing global trade tensions that constantly rock our fragile world. Despite Vietnam making ground on China's economic territory, the truth of the matter is, China's advanced supply chain and supplier network, driven by the government's long-term national policies, make it a manufacturing giant. At present, no one country, including Vietnam itself, can fully replace China's manufacturing capacity. Let's take a moment to assume that in some way, Vietnam could bridge this gap and replace the Dragon of the East. Even if this were possible, it most certainly would not happen overnight. This is a process that will take time as businesses figure out which parts to relocate and how to navigate those waters. It will likely be messy to begin with, but processes will get easier over time if they were to happen at all. So you see, it's a yes and no situation. Looking inward, Vietnam's government has been pushing to move from being a low-tech manufacturer to high-tech manufacturing. Recent investments from Intel, Samsung, and UAC show that there is immense potential in the country. And while it is safe to say that Vietnam can't absorb all of China's manufacturing, it is well positioned to take on more production, along with other countries in the region, and to play an important role in global value chains. We believe the best way to tell the tale of this Asian country is in this one statement: Vietnam is growing at its own pace and its own way. Whether it will truly eclipse China or not is something that time will tell.
China's stock market is collapsing. One of its benchmark stock indexes, the CSI 300, is down nearly 40% since its peak in 2021. This index measures the value of China's 300 biggest publicly traded companies, and currently, it sits at a 5-year low. Tencent has lost 60% of its stock price, and that's China's biggest company by market capitalization. In just 3 years, all Chinese stocks combined have lost $6 trillion in market value. That's more than the economy of any other country except for the US and China. Now, this may not seem all that important for outsiders, but actually it's a symptom of a wider economic downturn. As the value of Chinese businesses is dropping, China's economy is clearly not doing well, and people are starting to lose confidence. This is bad for the CCP, especially because this is not happening in the United States. The benchmark index of the USA, the S&P 500, is actually doing quite well at the moment. It represents America's 500 most valuable public companies. After a year-long downturn in 2022, the index has been rallying ever since. So, China is underperforming as compared to its rival and the rest of the world. This has earned it the title of the worst stock market in 2023. For the CCP, this is bad for its reputation, both at home and abroad. And it also raises some eyebrows when we look at China's GDP numbers. According to the CCP, the Chinese economy grew 5.2% in 2023. That is still low for Chinese standards, but there's a huge disconnect. The authorities say that China's economy continues to grow, while the markets say that it's absolutely collapsing. With a little common sense, it's easy to see what's happening. The CCP is trying to spread a false narrative about its economy to remain in power. And that's why it's currently censoring any negative takes on China's economy on the internet. In this video, we'll uncover what's truly going on with China's stock market and the underlying economy. As you'll see, China's once successful experiment with the free market might be coming to an end. Let's start with the economy, as the stock market and the economy go hand in hand. So, the GDP numbers from the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics might give us a wrong picture about the economy. But first of all, we need to look at the shenanigans happening inside of the Chinese stock market. You see, at least a part of China's stock market is also fake. In 2019, over 50% of China's stocks were owned by institutional investors, and this number is on the rise. Institutional investors are organizations like banks, mutual funds, pensions, or insurance providers. They buy stocks to grow their capital. These kinds of investors also have a huge share of the United States stock market. But there's one key difference. In China, the CCP has a lot of influence over these institutions. Last year, Xi Jinping announced a new financial regulatory body called the National Financial Regulatory Administration. This organization centralizes the CCP's control over the financial sector. Basically, Xi Jinping wants the banks to put capital where the CCP needs it, putting an end to free market times. By pouring capital into the stock market, the CCP is already artificially keeping the prices up to fight the market crash. According to the Swiss UBS Bank, Chinese-backed funds have already bought $57 billion worth of stocks this year. The CCP-owned China Investment Corporation plans to continue pumping up the prices on the market. But most importantly, all of these non-CCP banks might also be influenced. With the new regulatory body, Chinese banks aren't allowed to hurt the CCP's political goals. Right now, that goal is to create an image of a strong Chinese economy. This is why China's institutional investors might not sell as many stocks as they would want to. Still, it's not hard to see how this won't work. There's a reason for the huge sell-off. Chinese companies earning less revenue and profits than they used to. Keeping the price up will create a bubble, which can only last so long. But Xi Jinping doesn't blame himself for the financial trouble. Instead, he points the finger at the bankers. Right now, he is cracking down on the hedonistic bankers that don't align with the CCP's goals. They've received huge pay cuts, and bonuses were slashed by 60%. Recently, China's anti-corruption agency released a warning to the financial industry. It would seriously investigate and deal with the people who neglect the party's leadership in financial work and state-owned enterprises. It also said that bankers should stop having a singular focus on money, like in the West, and that they shouldn't form a financial elite. So, something that the CCP really hates is short selling. Basically, short selling is where you make money when a price of a stock goes down, through complex contracts. The Chinese Securities Regulatory Commission said it had zero tolerance for short sellers and that they would lose their shirts and rot in jail. Now, to be fair, there's definitely a point to be made against some bad financial practices. After all, we only have to look at the 2008 financial crisis to see how things can really go wrong. However, that's not completely what's going on here. In reality, the CCP is doing this to game its financial sector. Because the party can fire bankers at any point on the basis of degeneracy, it basically owns them. Going back to the stock market, this has some big effects. As the banks and funds aren't allowed to hurt the CCP's image, the real stock collapse might be even bigger. Even with the CCP's efforts, though, the stock market is still in a downward spiral. This is because retail and foreign investors are selling off their Chinese stocks en masse. There's something fundamental that the CCP can't cheat its way out of: an economic downturn. The earnings of companies on the Chinese MSCI index fell for 4 straight quarters. Apple, which recently posted its first yearly increase in earnings, had one weak spot: the Chinese market. Where the rest of the world had steady growth, Apple's revenue in China declined by 13%. In general, the Chinese economy has never really recovered from the COVID pandemic. Other nations have seen a rebound since the lockdowns due to huge stimulus programs. Consumer spending increased so much that there was even an inflationary crisis all over the world. But in China, well, the opposite happened. It's now in a crisis of deflation. That may sound unfamiliar to many, because the United States last experienced deflation back in 2007 and 2008. It is the opposite of inflation, meaning that prices go down over time. This may sound nice for the consumers, but it's terrible for the economy. Consumers will delay their purchases, meaning that revenues of companies will go down. Let's say you've been saving up to buy a new car. If you know the price is going to drop in the future, you may decide to just wait a while. But if everybody does this, car dealers and manufacturers have a big problem. This applies for every other industry as well. And as a result, the entire economy slows with rising unemployment and declining investments. For China, this is a real risk, as deflation is increasing at alarming speeds. In January of 2024, consumer prices in China declined at their fastest pace in 14 years. But actually, this isn't what's plaguing the Chinese economy the most. If we dig a little deeper, we find another core problem. The deflation is related to something called the debt deflation spiral. Because of problems in China's financial industry, credit is drying up. This is the root cause for the decline in spending and, in turn, the increase in deflation. And as the financial sector and spending are related to the stock market, these problems also lay the basis for the stock market's collapse. So let's dive a little deeper into what's happening with this debt deflation spiral, shall we? Now, you may think that the debt problem in the United States is getting pretty bad, but then you haven't seen what's happening in China. Washington holds about 120% of its GDP in government debt. In China, this debt to GDP ratio is a whopping 280%. It's not the government in Beijing that issued these debts, as the central government holds only 1/14 of the debt pile. The bulk of it is held by local governments. During the last 15 years, they founded many local government financial vehicles called LGFVs. These are local government enterprises that prop up the economy. In 2022, there were almost 3,000 of them. They held about 80 trillion yuan, or $11 trillion, in debts. To put that into perspective, we're talking about approximately half of China's GDP in liabilities. In total, state-owned enterprises held 2/3 of corporate debt. More than 60% of this debt was in the form of bank loans. The problem is that most of these LGFVs aren't able to repay their loans. A third of them don't have a positive cash flow, and 60% struggle to pay their interest with their own earnings. Without support from the local governments, many of these companies wouldn't have existed in the first place. So this begs the question: how much of China's GDP is actually real? Another problem is the huge bubble of non-performing loans that this has created. After all, who's going to pay for the $11 trillion in debt? Last year, Xi Jinping ordered state banks to restructure LGFV debts at lower interest rates. But of course, he has a price to pay for this. All of these bad loans hurt the Chinese economy because there's less capital to invest in actually profitable businesses. The same is true when we look at its real estate crisis. Over the last few years, China's real estate sector has turned into a huge debt bubble. This is a big deal, as Chinese property is the single biggest asset class in the world. It's gotten so bad that the CCP is pushing banks to provide $446 billion to property developers. 50 of them are on the brink of financial collapse, including infamous companies like Country Garden. They've run huge Ponzi schemes which came crashing down from 2020 onwards. Basically, the developers bought land and sold houses that they haven't built yet. With the money they received, they bought more land and then just did exactly the same thing. In 2019 and 2020, 90% of properties were sold with this pre-sale model. This led to huge liabilities on the developer side, with Country Garden and Evergrande holding more than $500 billion of them. This was made possible by corruption, but also because local governments needed to meet GDP goals. At its peak, the real estate market made up 25 to 30% of GDP. Because it was one of the key drivers of growth, local governments turned a blind eye to the Ponzi schemes. And initially, people weren't worried about the possible debt bubble. There was incredible demand for housing, and people thought prices would only go up. In early 2019, the price for a new house increased more than 10% year on year. Approximately 70% of Chinese household wealth was stored in real estate, and buying a house was very popular. The developers thought that their debts were no big deal, as housing sales would just continue. But now, the sector is in turmoil. The recent collapse of the property giant Evergrande shows that the real estate boom didn't last forever. In 2020, the CCP intervened to stop the debt bubble from growing. It limited the pre-sale housing model, and banks stopped financing the property developers. Together with a slowdown in housing sales, this was the last straw. In 2021, Evergrande began to miss interest payments on $300 billion of its debts. After a period of battles with debt holders, Evergrande was finally liquidated earlier this year. Many fear that other property developers will follow in its footsteps. Now, you may be asking yourself what the local governments and property developers have to do with the stock market. But in fact, the LGFV and real estate crisis are some of the biggest reasons for the collapse. First of all, we have to look at the financial sector. China's economic growth of the past decades has been fueled by lending, which allows massive investments into businesses and infrastructure. And not just a little bit. In China, investment makes up 42% of GDP, which is heavily dependent on credit. Between 2007 and 2016, China's credit grew 18.1% annually, faster than the economy itself. Right now, China's financial system holds $53 trillion in assets, more than half of the size of the world economy. To put that in comparison, U.S. banks only hold $30 trillion in assets. So the credit growth caused the pile of assets in China's banks to balloon. But this Chinese credit machine is coming to an end. Chinese banks have to deal with a massive increase in non-performing loans. Basically, money that they've lent and they're not getting back. Some analysts say that it ranges in the trillions of dollars, although the official figures are much lower. The insane amount of borrowing has backfired, because many loans weren't really even viable in the first place. Apart from raising the risk of bank insolvencies, this also means that overall spending will slow as credit dries up. The bad debts show that China's financial system can't keep expanding forever. We can already see this in China's outside investments. But as you can see on this chart from Boston University, it looks like China's Belt and Road Initiative funds have fallen off a cliff. Many of the $1 trillion already planned projects have also been canceled. The same happened with China's holdings of U.S. debts, which dropped 40% to a 14-year low. This all shows that Chinese funds and banks need the money at home. What's even worse is that this financial turmoil results in deflation. Banks giving out less loans means there's less money available. Using basic supply and demand economics, this causes prices to go down. But there's a catch. This can spiral out of control. During a period of deflation, the real value of debt increases because the value of money goes up. In simpler terms, businesses with debt carry a load that just keeps on getting heavier. Eventually, this can lead to the collapse of these businesses because it's hard to stay afloat with that much weight on top of you. In turn, this leads to even more non-performing loans, less lending by banks, and more deflation. The stock market is anticipating something like this because it thinks that the Chinese economy is heading for a debt deflation loop. It's like a domino effect. One problem leads to another, and the whole market feels the impact. Before talking about the next effect, I need to ask for something. Because bad news about China's economy often gets censored, this video won't get far in the algorithm without your support. By leaving a like down below, you help us tremendously. All right, without further ado, let's get back to the basics. These problems in China's financial sector also have a huge effect on the confidence in China's economy. To understand this, we have to look at the price-to-earnings ratio on the Chinese stock market. This is the price of the stocks divided by the earnings of the underlying companies. For overall confidence, these numbers are very telling. The higher the price-to-earnings ratio, the more expensive the companies are, and the more trust there is in the future. After all, you only pay a higher price if you think the businesses are about to grow. When the price-to-earnings ratios go down, well, it's the exact opposite. People think growth is coming to an end, and they pay lower prices for companies. That's exactly what happened in China, as we can see on this chart from JP Morgan. In 2021, the price-to-earnings ratios peaked at 19, so stocks were 19 times their underlying earnings. At the start of 2024, however, the stock prices were only 9 times their underlying earnings. So the price-to-earnings ratios were down more than 50%. In other words, trust in the future was cut in half. We can see the same development in the price-to-book ratio. This is the price of companies compared to their book value, the money they're worth if they sell off all their assets. You can think of this as their net worth. In the United States, stocks are worth 4 to 5 times as much as their book values. That means companies are expected to grow in value and not go bankrupt. In China, however, the price-to-book ratio is only 1.7, dropping to a 5-year low. So the data are clear. People don't have confidence in Chinese businesses anymore. This is also true for foreign investors. For years, banks and investment funds invested a lot of capital into the Chinese economy because of its growth miracle. In 2021, foreign direct investment peaked at more than $300 billion. But now, the country has the first outflow of foreign direct investment in 25 years. As you can see on this chart, it reached negative $11.8 billion in the third quarter of 2023. Last January, the outflow in the stock market reached more than $2 billion. This is the longest and strongest outflow of foreign capital since 2014. The debt deflation spiral is obviously one of the biggest reasons for the lack of confidence. But we also have to talk about the increased geopolitical risks. Because China and the United States are competing for power, there has been an economic face-off. This began to gain steam during the Trump administration, where he placed many sanctions on CCP entities and put import tariffs on Chinese goods. His argument was that the massive trade deficit with China, which reached $418 billion in 2018, was hurting the American economy. In the following trade war, the United States and China increased tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade. U.S. President Joe Biden left the tariffs on $350 billion worth of Chinese goods. In the area of technology, he even escalated the trade war. The United States has tried to cut China off of technological developments by limiting its chip access. There are just a few American, Dutch, and Japanese companies that control the advanced chip supply chain. All of these companies are not allowed anymore to sell their most advanced products to China. For example, NVIDIA can't sell its most advanced AI chips to the Chinese market. China's own chip companies are several years behind the Western ones. So this is a huge obstacle for its technological progress. And there are fears that the geopolitical turmoil could get even worse. There's a real chance that China invades Taiwan in the near future. A U.S. general predicts that this could happen as soon as next year. Xi Jinping is already 70 years old, and he may want to reunify China before he passes away. If the situation around Taiwan escalates, the trade war between the United States and China will obviously worsen. Washington and its allies could adopt the same strategy as Russia, namely to cut China off from world trade. But the thing is this, that's already happening to some extent. As the relation between Washington and Beijing worsened, companies started to diversify out of China. The new Apple manufacturing plant in India is an example of this. Because of these geopolitical developments, China is slowly losing its position as the world's manufacturing powerhouse. This also has its effect on the stock market, as the future of China looks a whole lot less bright. But the fact that the stock market shows all of this also has political consequences. It's not hard to see why the Chinese Communist Party and the stock market aren't a match made in heaven. The stock market is one of the hallmarks of capitalism, and that's something China isn't very comfortable with. Or is it? Starting in 1978, the country started to implement free market reforms under Deng Xiaoping. He created special economic zones, which don't have a planned economy. As we all know, this was highly successful. Millions of Chinese moved from rural areas to the cities, and real wages exploded, as you can see on this chart. Although the CCP still likes to classify China's economy as developing, it's really a developed one already. GDP growth was in the double digits for years, and China has risen on the global economic leaderboard. Where it was the 7th biggest in real GDP in 1980, it quickly became second, overtaking Japan. It went from a GDP of $396 billion to almost $20 trillion, a 50-fold increase. The reason for this was quite simple. China had something to offer the world's free markets. It had an abundance of cheap labor, so could outcompete anyone in the field of manufacturing. Although the Chinese government was still communist in name, it increasingly adopted capitalist ideas. The Shanghai Stock Exchange, which was first opened in 1866, was reopened in 1990. In 1993, the CCP went as far as to amend its constitution and to create a socialist market economy system. It's basically capitalism with a lot of wiggle room for government influence. This marked the end of China's Maoist period, with the disastrous Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. But when Xi Jinping rose to power in 2013, things started to change. Where his predecessors liberalized and decentralized the country, he did the exact opposite. By removing the term limits for the presidency in 2018, Xi Jinping has practically become China's supreme leader for life. This has also had its effects on the economy. Xi sees the free market economy as a huge threat to his power, which is why he may be ending the capitalist experiment. He doesn't see the private sector as something on its own, but as something to serve the CCP's goals. The party wants to cultivate a team of private economic persons who are resolute in walking with the party. If you phrase this a little differently, it wants private enterprises to do what the CCP says. To achieve this, it has established CCP bodies in many of China's companies. 92% of China's top 500 companies have these bodies, a number that has been on the rise during Xi's presidency. To further solidify his rule over the private sector, Xi Jinping has also been cracking down on many of China's entrepreneurs. In the last few years, China has arrested multiple prominent businessmen, including Jack Ma. Xi Jinping says this is to fight corruption, but many experts think it's something different. The Chinese president wants the most powerful citizens to know who's in charge. With these political changes in mind, we can look at the possible reactions of the CCP to the stock market collapse. For Xi Jinping, it's both a huge threat and a giant opportunity. On the one hand, it reveals that he failed with his economic policies. The reason why the Chinese put up with Xi's power grab is that he provides stability, prosperity, and growth. As the stock market shows, the situation is now the exact opposite. This could result in him losing support. But if Xi Jinping plays his cards right, he can also benefit from the current stock market crisis. He can just point the finger at the private sector, as he already does to some extent. This gives him a reason to return to a centralized economy, giving him even more power. All in all, the stock market shows a very interesting story. It reveals a lot about the false CCP narratives, the underlying problems of China's economy, and the lack of trust in the country's future. This definitely won't be the last video I do on China's economy, so be sure to subscribe and keep updated. And as always, thanks for watching. YouTube's algorithm thinks you'll like this video the most. Click and find out if it's right.
CCP's great plan to take over the world is failing spectacularly.
Belt and Road Initiative has suffered yet another blow. The Philippines has decided to exit it.
Italy, the G7 member to join China's Belt and Road, is dumping China's biggest international project.
Many Belt and Road participants have been struggling to pay back billions in loans.
Many of China's loans have fared badly.
Is this the beginning of the end of BRI?
Italy was one of the most important members of CCP's Belt and Road Initiative, as it was the only country from the G7 in there. But now, Italy is pulling out of BRI and starting a domino effect that will kill all of CCP's hopes and dreams of taking over the world. But BRI was destined to fail long before Italy's withdrawal, as many countries had figured out CCP's sinister motives behind the project, and they had started preemptively killing BRI before CCP had a chance to take over the country. Here are two pictures to show the downfall of BRI. Here's the member picture at the start of the project, and here's a time-lapse of member pictures from last 3 years. Every year, more and more countries drop out. Soon, it will just be Xi and Putin left standing at the BRI grave. So, let's get into why countries are leaving BRI and what this means for the future of CCP. First, please take a second to hit the like button below. CCP bots are not happy when we cover China, and often videos are downvoted by the bots to kill it in the algorithm. So your likes help us out a lot. Let's start. I know the first question everyone is going to have is, why was Italy in Belt and Road to begin with? If you know anything about Belt and Road Initiative, you know China is purposefully targeting low-income countries. So let's first dig into Italy's reasoning behind joining before we get into why many other countries, including Italy, are wanting out of BRI. Italy joined the venture back in 2019, long after the program was started. So we have to back up a little to 2019 and look at Italy's economic and political climate during that time to understand the motivation behind joining. Italy always had an economic relationship with China. In 1980s, Romano Prodi, future Prime Minister of Italy, was the president of Italy's Institute for Industrial Reconstruction. This is when China asked him to build a factory in Tianjin. In return, his Chinese counterparts helped him build a factory in what was then the Soviet Union. Once he became the Prime Minister in 1997, Prodi led a massive trade mission to China, bringing over 100 companies to promote joint ventures in engineering, pharmaceutical, food, textile, fashion, and finance. Most Italian prime ministers since then have shared Prodi's warmth towards China. CCP's launch of BRI only made this relationship more enticing for Italians, at least at the time. They noticed that whenever China invested in a European country, that country saw a massive uptick in economic activity in short term. We'll dig more into this point later in the video. For now, a great example of this was when a Chinese shipping company bought a controlling stake in the Greek port of Piraeus in 2016. Maritime transport is an important part of the BRI because the vast majority of China-Europe trade travels on ships. After China acquired the port of Piraeus, 13% of Chinese trade passed through Greece, compared to just 2% 7 years earlier. Italy feared that if it stayed out of the BRI, it could miss trade opportunities and may even lose business as it gets stolen by other countries in BRI. Specifically, Italian ports on Adriatic Sea could lose business should the port of Piraeus become linked to Central Europe via rail, because this would mean that the trade bypassed Italy entirely instead of landing in Italian ports and being transported by Italian railways. Italy also hoped that with signing into BRI, they would fix the imbalance in trade between China and Italy. At the time, China was exporting heavily to Italy and very little Italian exports went into China. On top of this, the Italian government at the time was already clashing with the EU, budget deficit being a big arguing point between both of them. Election time promises had raised Italy's budget deficit to 2.4%, which broke agreements with EU that Italy had made earlier. Dealing with the CCP was Italy's way of showing the EU that they have other friends that they are willing to turn to. Italy's move also came at a time when EU was trying to tackle China's growing influence in Europe and Africa. Italy's decision seemed like it was undermining the EU's attempt to compete with China's economic might. But 4 years later, Italy now realizes that BRI was not all that CCP made it out to be. They realized that BRI was just a way for China to help its economy while not providing anything to other countries. So let's quickly go over why China launched BRI and what was CCP's original plan all along. For this, we need to back up a little to 2013. China was one of the fastest growing countries in the world at this point, and it was becoming bigger than just a factory for world's manufacturing. It was a powerful and rich nation, but the future was bleak. Growth was slowing down. The young population that had fueled China's past growth was getting old, and CCP's one-child policy had put a huge dent in China's future population. But this all did not deter the communist government from focusing outwards and growing its power around the world. So Xi Jinping launched the most ambitious project in the history to increase China's influence around the globe. China would give out loans to poor, struggling nations in the name of help. But in return, China would gain control over countries' valuable resources or strategic locations. Now you may ask, what if these countries can't pay back the loans? Well, then China would just get control over imported resources like gold, silver, and oil. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get more into this in just a second. Let's get back to the story. Initially, the project was called One Belt and One Road Project. But some countries wonder, why is it named One Belt and One Road? Is it because China would be the only one in control? So, to avoid any misunderstanding, CCP changed the name to Belt and Road Initiative. And the plan began.
China's Belt and Road Initiative. BRI is a gigantic plan for a global network of ports, roads, railways, and other infrastructure to connect China to the world.
It is also a way through which China confirms its role as a global power.
Together, they account for 40% of the global GDP, 65% of the world's population, and 75% of the known energy reserves.
我们的共同目标是
China started loaning out billions of dollars to countries all around the world. It had given $12 billion to Sri Lanka, $26 billion to Pakistan, and $3 billion to Tajikistan. In total, it would have given close to $1 trillion to more than 100 countries, most of them being poor and struggling. So, when these countries default, China is able to get access to valuable resources and spread its influence. It controls power plants and strategic ports in Pakistan, gold and silver mines in Tajikistan, and quite famously, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. We'll talk more about this soon, but first, you guys might be wondering, why would these countries accept loans if they know China's true intentions? Well, unlike what Dave Ramsey says, loans aren't necessarily a bad thing. Now, things get wildly complicated when you look at a whole economy. So for simplicity purposes, I'll use a simple example for the explanation. Let's say you're a head of a car rental company which has 3 cars. Right now, you're making $1,500 in profit per month renting out cars. Now, let's say someone comes to you and offers to loan you some money so you can buy a 4th car, which can make you another $500 in profit. Now, as long as you use the loan to buy a car like Toyota, whose monthly payment is less than $500, then this is a profitable business move for you, as the car will be making more than what the loan payment is. But if you buy a car like Mercedes, which has monthly payment of more than $500, even though the car looks good, it's not really a good business move, because now you're actually worse off compared to before you took out the loan. You're actually making less profit, since now you have to use the profits from other cars to pay off the loan for the Mercedes. Now, a country's economy is a lot more complex than the example I just gave, but the basics are still pretty similar. For any project that's built using the loan, as long as the output in GDP is higher than the cost of the loan, the country would consider that loan a good thing. But if the project from the loan doesn't turn out productive, then it's extremely bad news for these developing countries, as it pushes their economy even further back. And if China is involved, that just makes things 10 times worse, as you learn soon. Now, this is why when the World Bank gives out loans to poor countries, they come with conditions. They have to show where the money is going, how it's being used, and if it even makes sense to use that money on certain projects. This helps eliminate or at least limit corruption and malinvestments from these loans. This is why Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka was denied the construction by several other lenders because the investment just didn't make sense from an economic standpoint. Sri Lanka already had a thriving port in the capital Colombo. And even though the demand was growing, it was nowhere near close to a point where it would make sense to sink so much money into a new port. China, on the other hand, didn't really care about the feasibility of the port when it loaned out the money to Sri Lanka. In fact, it didn't really care about how money was used in most countries, and it was all by design. You see, China's goal with these loans was not to increase the economic output of the developing nation. No. Its main goal was to gain influence over its politicians. Politicians who had decision-making powers in the country. Politicians who could sway the public opinion in favor of China. And politicians who could push China's agenda on the international stage. China would just give out loans with no oversight so the politician can use the funds to win elections and stay in power. That's exactly what happened with the Hambantota port, as it was built in then-President Rajapaksa's hometown just to win political points with the public. Eventually, the Rajapaksa's family's corruption led to Sri Lanka's thriving economy to bankruptcy, and the family fled the country to avoid charges. But as long as politicians are cozying up to China, CCP doesn't really care about how these loans are used. I'm sure that the communist government prefers that these corrupt politicians stay in power as long as possible. When China took over the Hambantota port, a lot of experts gave them the benefit of doubt and explained that this was purely a business deal to recoup the loan money, and China had no plans to turn it into a military naval base. But according to recent news reports, as soon as Sri Lanka goes bankrupt, China tries stationing a military ship in the port, and that plan was only delayed because India showed a strong protest against China setting up a military base in India's backyard. China has constantly encroached on India's northern borders, and India has no plan on giving in to China's aggressive behavior. But that's the story for another video.
Now, the Chinese policy in Africa is often described as a debt trap.
At a summit with African leaders, China's president dismissing claims of a new colonialism.
It is a part of a deliberate strategy to loan unmanageable sums to African countries. Beijing is winning lion's share of construction projects in Africa.
A win-win partnership or a debt trap?
Now, let's talk about Africa. CCP has used the same tactics on countries in Africa to gain influence over politicians there. This is how China was able to set up a military base in this small but important country, Djibouti. Djibouti controls the axis between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, one of the busiest maritime trade routes, and now China has a military base there and a controlling stake in the port that sits right on the choke point. China has also built the headquarters of the African Union in Ethiopia, but Chinese companies left something behind when they finished the projects. They had bugged the whole building and its servers. Because of this, CCP always knew what African politicians were discussing and planning, and this way CCP always had influence over Africa. Johnny Harris has a great video on this that I'll link at the end, but you guys might be wondering, why a Chinese company was building the headquarters for the African Union? Well, this is where we need to look at the terms of these loans that China was giving out. You see, these loans came with a lot of strings, and all of them were in favor of China. One of the most common terms in all these loans is that any project funded by these loans must be given to a Chinese company to build. So, if a country wants to build a port, they hire a Chinese company. They want to build a power plant, they hire a Chinese company. And if they want to build a parliament, they hire a Chinese company. This is how the CCP was able to bug the African Union Parliament. But problems don't just end there. These Chinese companies mostly bring workers from China to work on these projects. Even food for these workers is imported from China. So, at the end of the day, most of the money that China is giving out as loan ends up finding its way back to China, while these developing countries are stuck holding the bills. Add on to that, a lot of these projects are becoming a non-productive part of the economy. There's the port and airport in Sri Lanka that no one is using. There's another port in Pakistan that's barely used for commercial purposes. And there are thousands of new apartment buildings in Angola that are simply sitting empty. These are just few examples of malinvestments from Chinese loans that are all too common. Big reason behind these failures is that most of the time, there is no demand for these services. But since there is no oversight with these loans, they end up being built anyway. Because of these projects add little to no value to the local economies. And the loans behind the projects actually take money away from the local budget in form of interest payments and debt repayment. This has turned into a horrible situation for a lot of countries. If we remember our car example, because of these bad investments, countries are now stuck using their money for paying these loans instead of reinvesting that money into actual beneficial projects. Some of these repayment terms on these loans are also a bit aggressive, to say the least. Usually, when the World Bank gives out loan, it comes with the interest of 1 to 3% and payback period of 30 years. But these Chinese loans come with an interest rate as high as 7% and payback period of only 15 years. Because of this, a lot of struggling countries were unable to make payments and defaulted on their loans. This is when China came up with a solution. It went to the struggling nation and said, hey, since you can't pay back the loan, would you be fine with us just taking over the resource mines and we'll forgive the loan? Or you can just lease us this important port and we will extend the loan so you have more time to pay it back. Or in Angola's case, China got country's oil when the country defaulted on the loans. It even went as far as asking countries to stop recognizing Taiwan as a country and vote in favor of China's agenda during important United Nations votes. And if a country doesn't listen to China, well, then CCP's economic blackmail begins. Lithuania is a perfect example of this. In 2021, Lithuania set up a diplomatic office in Taiwan and invited Taiwan to set up an office in Lithuania under the name Taiwan. This is a big deal. Just for context, usually countries don't let Taiwanese offices use the name Taiwan, so not to anger CCP over their One China policy. It is a common practice for Taiwan to use the name Taipei overseas. But Lithuania let them use the name Taiwan, which didn't please the CCP. So what did the CCP do? Launch an economic blackmail against Lithuania. First, CCP banned all the export and imports to Lithuania. But that didn't really make a difference, since these two countries didn't have a big trade relation to begin with. So, to increase the pressure, CCP started pressuring foreign companies to stop trading with Lithuania. In December 2021, Beijing warned firms that sourced products from Lithuania that they could find their commercial relations with China restricted. Soon after that, it was reported that automotive parts produced by Continental, a major German company that sources components from Lithuania, were unable to clear customs in China. These informal secondary sanctions have also increased the economic price borne by domestic firms in Lithuania. Biggest issue of all this is what China is doing with secondary sanction is a big violation of World Trade Organization rules, which China is part of. If China was never accepted into WTO in 2001, then it wouldn't be where it is today economically. And now, China is brazenly just breaking its rules. This is just one of many examples of China bullying other nations, especially the smaller ones. But Lithuania didn't back down and is still going. Anyways, coming back to the BRI, as the news of China's practices with the loans spread across the world, the countries got more cautious about accepting Chinese help. And some countries went as far as to cancel all the projects they had agreed to already. But that didn't stop the CCP. To avoid bad publicity, CCP started requiring countries to not disclose any loan amount or loan terms to the public. So oftentimes, when a poor government takes on a loan from China, it's quite possible that the country's citizens might not find out about it. Because of its aggressive lending, China became one of the biggest lenders in the world, loaning out close to $1 trillion. This is where it made a big mistake. It was a bit too aggressive. Due to the aggressive terms, a lot of the countries have started to default, and China was not expecting such a high rate so soon. COVID did play a big part in nation not being able to pay these loans. But even before COVID, failure rates on these loans were high. China was often forced to loan out more money to keep countries afloat, as you can see in this chart. Between 2019 and the end of 2021, Beijing granted $104 billion in rescue loans, a figure almost as large as China's bailout lending worldwide in previous 2 decades. This makes you question, why was China helping countries stay afloat after everything we just talked about? Well, because much like in Sri Lanka, if a country defaults, the government is overthrown and China would lose its influence over the corrupt politicians, which it had bribed for so long. Now, every time I mention Sri Lanka on this channel, a lot of people point out that according to official figures, only 10% of Sri Lanka's debt was owed to China. Now, that number may not be correct. As I mentioned earlier, because of bad press, a lot of Chinese loans were lent out in secrecy. On top of that, a good portion of Sri Lanka's loans were owned by Chinese banks. And we have to remember, there is no such thing as a private company in China. CCP has tremendous amount of influence over these banks. Just wanted to clarify that. Now back to the video. One of the worst examples of BRI failure is Pakistan. Pakistan's foreign debt has nearly doubled since 2015 to $100 billion, with Chinese lenders collectively being the largest creditor at around $30 billion. Islamabad spends around half of country's revenue on servicing foreign debt and needed a $3 billion loan from IMF in June to avoid defaulting amid an acute financial crisis. Pakistan isn't alone. Increasing numbers of BRI borrowers are being pushed to the brink of insolvency by a slowdown in global growth, rising interest rate, and record high debt levels in developing world. While the West is trying to figure out a way to restructure these debt, China has been blocking these negotiations. You see, Western countries have something called the Paris Club. It's a group of major creditors whose role is to negotiate debt restructuring when payment difficulties are experienced. Though China is not part of the Paris Club, the organization has invited China to negotiate debts for the struggling countries, being that China is now the biggest bilateral lender. But China has always refused to work with other creditors to help struggling countries, making it more difficult for other creditors to restructure the debt. China, in fact, wants the Western creditors like the IMF and the World Bank to forgive their debts so the poor countries can repay the Chinese loans. Which is, of course, not good for these struggling countries or the IMF. Only party that benefits is the CCP. First, it was the CCP who gave out unsustainable loans, and now it wants others to bail out China. Biggest losers of all this are the developing countries that were just trying to help their citizens. Zambia is a prime example. Of roughly $20 billion of external debt that IMF tallied in 2022, $2.7 billion was lent by international development banks. $1.3 billion comes from various Western governments. Bank loans come to $1.6 billion. Local bond debt comes to $3.3 billion, and international dollar bond debt comes to $3.3 billion too. But the biggest chunk is nearly $6 billion owed to China. The IMF has reached a support agreement with Zambia that is conditional on its debt burden becoming sustainable. But China refuses to agree to the terms, making it impossible to restructure Zambia's debt. In the meantime, Zambia says it has accumulated about $1.2 billion in arrears since default, and that number is only growing. Unfortunately, Zambia's situation is not unique. Currently, 15% of the countries in the world are in debt distress, and half of the countries in the world are at a high risk of falling into it, all because China wanted more influence across the world. Luckily, other global powers saw CCP's true motive with the BRI early on and launched their own initiative to counter CCP's ambitions. US launched the International Development Finance Corporation in 2018, and then at G7 meeting in 2021, President Biden launched a Build Back Better World initiative, repackaged it next year as the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. The European Union in 2021 launched its Global Gateway, which aims to leverage up a relatively modest amount of public money to fund 300 billion euros of investment in connectivity projects over 6 years. Then lastly, India launched its own investment fund to get out of CCP's encirclement of important Indian trade routes. Let's go over all these one by one. Let's start with the US program. In 2021, the G7 Forum launched its own infrastructure project to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. The so-called Build Back Better World, B3W in short, would provide hundreds of billions of dollars to underdeveloped countries. The idea was that the project would help with financing global infrastructure projects by giving out loans with low interest rates. Africa, with its huge infrastructure gap, was supposed to be at the core of this program. The reason for starting the B3W appears to be simple. Countries like the United States, Canada, or the United Kingdom didn't want to stay behind on the huge investments that China was making. And similarly to the Global Gateway, this new B3W program was value-driven. The forum wanted to focus on sustainability, transparency, gender equality, and climate change. The G7 argued that this value-driven approach is what separated B3W program from its BRI counterpart. The focus on quality loans, and not just the quantity of them, could lead to better results. But to make an impact on a huge infrastructure gap in underdeveloped countries, you need a lot of money. The estimates are that Africa needs $100 billion annually to tackle its infrastructure deficit. And G7 isn't unaware of this. But even G7, as powerful as it is, can't easily provide this kind of money. That's one of the reasons why B3W projects never really took off. The program stayed really vague and it hasn't competed with China's BRI in any way. The fact that entire B3W project was renamed after 1 year says a lot. In 2022, the US started a brand new and a game-changing project with its G7 allies. Keep in mind, this was just 1 year after the Build Back Better World program was launched. The 2022 version was called Program for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PG2 in short. This new program is mostly the same as B3W, just packaged under a different name. The United States aims to mobilize $200 billion by 2027, and together with other G7 partners, it will mobilize $600 billion. Much of the funding will have to come from private sector. The G7 won't actually provide this huge sum of money themselves, but instead, it looks at banks and investment firms to help out. Whether this will work out, who knows? In China, the government can force its bank to help the Belt and Road Initiative, but whether the US can access capital this way is well questionable. Nevertheless, it is clear that the United States and its allies are seeing the potential that underdeveloped countries, and especially Africa, have. The G7 is trying to invest in the African continent to reduce the infrastructure gap and to gain more influence. The United States is also starting to realize just how important Africa will be in the future. Washington is not only investing in the infrastructure through PG2, but it's also looking to expand mutual trade relations. With Prosper Africa Initiative, multiple US government agencies are working together to achieve this goal. The project is connecting US businesses to African markets by providing helpful services. With the initiative, the US government wants to spark private investments, import and exports with the African continent through the private sector. For example, it has helped a Texas company win a contract with the government of Ghana. If the United States succeeds in getting the private sector on board, it will help with competing against China. The US government can't launch massive programs as efficiently as the authoritarian CCP, but it does have its good old capitalism and very powerful businesses. If the United States can convince its businesses to help win influence in Africa, the BRI has a serious competitor. Apart from the US, the EU, and China, there are many other players looking to invest in Africa. For example, India and the UAE are combining their forces to invest in African infrastructure. Singapore is also strategically investing and building up trade relationships with the continent. And other countries like South Korea, Japan, the United Kingdom are doing exactly the same. Let's talk about the EU for a minute. The European Union responded to the Chinese plans by launching its own program. With the Global Gateway Investment Package, the EU wants to help underdeveloped countries by developing digital, transportation, and infrastructure networks. Until 2027, the European Union will mobilize up to 300 billion euros for its global project, of which 150 billion euros will go to the African countries. Obviously, the European Union started this program as a response to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. After China started the multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure project, the EU couldn't just sit idly and do nothing in response. But many criticized the Global Gateway project for being nothing more than a PR stunt. 300 billion euros is nowhere near the amount that China has invested. It will be hard for Europe to compare against the Chinese investments. Apart from the differences in size, the EU project also had some different goals than its Chinese counterpart. China's sales pitch is building roads, bridges, and railways, all of that fast and cheap. But Europe's Global Gateway is focused more on sustainability and providing green energy solution. The program doesn't only concentrate on hard infrastructure, but also on soft infrastructure like healthcare and education systems. The critics of the project say that this approach won't work in Africa. Underdeveloped countries in Africa want to get a lot of infrastructure fast and cheap. Whether it's sustainable or not, they don't care. And they have had enough of aid packages. They want to solve the underlying problem, which is the economic underdevelopment. But in some cases, the European approach with quality projects over sheer quantity of them may actually reap some benefits. As we talked earlier, there are numerous Chinese infrastructure projects in Africa failing due to poor planning and execution. The standard gauge railway in Kenya is an example of this. A multi-billion-dollar railway project aimed to connect Uganda and Kenya with each other has failed dramatically. The railway project was stopped before it even crossed the Ugandan border because the Kenya government couldn't pay the Chinese debt anymore. The Kenyan government racked up a total of $4.7 billion in debt from this railway alone, and that's with a GDP of just $110 billion. Think about that, racking up more than 4% of your GDP in debt for one incomplete railway. Adding to this, the railway itself wasn't a feasible idea either. During the first 2 years of operation, the project lost $200 million. The railway still bleeds cash, even when it's operational. The reasons for this disaster vary from corruption to poor planning. This example is very telling. Sometimes the big shiny project turn out to be a terrible mistakes. The European Union, however, focuses on smaller and more sustainable projects, which gives it an advantage. From constructing 6 small hydropower plants in Nigeria to constructing a solar energy plant in Djibouti, Europe can make some small impacts with this program. And Europe does have some larger projects under the Global Gateway. For example, it's constructing a subsea power cable from Egypt to Greece to transmit renewable energy from Africa to Europe. The cost of the project is estimated to be around 900 million euros. And for Africa, working together with Europe certainly has its advantages. African leaders that value sustainability and don't want to end up with failed Chinese projects could turn to Europe instead. But the problem is that Europe doesn't have much capital. With the 6-year-long Global Gateway, the European Union is already struggling to scramble 300 billion euros for the funding of the projects. A lot of money needs to come from the private sector because the governments simply do not have the resources. There are several reasons for this, big one being that the economy of the European Union is smaller than that of China. The EU's economy amounts to around $16 trillion in GDP, while China has a nominal GDP of around $19 trillion. At least that's what it reports publicly. Like I've said in previous videos, China's GDP figures are well disputed to say the least. If you want the full video, you can go check it out. What it comes down to is that China's GDP numbers could be much lower than expected. So China's advantage in GDP numbers could be minimal or even non-existent. Nevertheless, the European Union has one more disadvantage when it comes to these huge investment programs. Many see European Union as a slow and bureaucratic organization. This is because it is a union with tons of different member states. Every single country needs to agree on every single policy it makes. When you're trying to organize billions of euros for a project like Global Gateway, it becomes hard to execute. The plan needs to go through several committees and councils, which is a process that can take months to complete. There are a lot of political differences within the European Union, something that doesn't make cooperation go very smoothly. In China, however, this is a whole lot different. China has an autocratic government in which Xi Jinping holds all the power. Now, this has a lot of disadvantages when it comes to things like civil rights and democratic values. And I'm not arguing that an autocratic government is any good, but a foreign investment program like Belt and Road Initiative is much easier to execute for dictatorships. Remember, the CCP indirectly controls a lot of Chinese banks, so it has access to tons of money. Xi Jinping can access billions of dollars without having to go through the same procedures as the EU. On top of that, Xi has control over a lot of Chinese businesses, so he can direct his resources top-down. And with his one-party state, Xi isn't going to have opposition against his investment plans. You can see why European Union is having a hard time competing against China. But that doesn't mean the Global Gateway isn't a headache for Chinese BRI. Definitely is. Lastly, we have India, who has become quite a thorn in CCP's way. To contain India, China has built pipelines both in Myanmar and Pakistan, from coast to intercity China. It has also secured long port leases in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Similarly, China has also set up a military base in Djibouti to control a vital strait off the coast of Djibouti that links the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. All the Asian exports bound for the Western markets must first pass through this vital strait before reaching the Suez Canal. Between 12 to 20% of all global trade passes through this strait, only 8 miles from China's space in Camp Lemoore. After seeing all the moves China has been making, a lot of military experts have pointed out that the Belt and Road is not just a geo-economic plan. It also has a military strategic advantage. The ports have increasingly come to play a potentially more menacing role as dual-use ports that can give the strengthened Chinese Navy a global reach it lacked entirely just a few years ago. These strategic investments are nicknamed the String of Pearls, as the goal is to encircle India and put pressure on New Delhi. India was aware of this already, but the war in Ukraine showed every country in the world how important it is to secure your economic interests. In modern world, wars can be won and lost before even stepping a foot on the battlefield. India realized that in the case of a war, China's String of Pearls can be used as a way to choke off India's access to the world. Adding to this, countries that received Chinese money were slow to criticize China whenever it would encroach on Indian borders. There is also a rumor that China plans to start setting up military bases in countries that receive Chinese loans. And of course, this was undoubtedly stressful for New Delhi, as it didn't want to be surrounded by Chinese military. So India started laying out its own plan to safeguard its economic interests. But it didn't just stop there. Later in the video, we'll go over how India is taking advantage of China's trade war with the USA to hurt China where it's the strongest, its manufacturing prowess. But first, let's go over how India is countering China's military. To counter the string of pearls, India started its own alliances to encircle China, nicknamed the Necklace of Diamonds. India is expanding its naval bases and is also improving relations with strategically placed countries to counter China's strategies. In 2018, India partnered with Singapore and Indonesia to get access to their naval bases of Changi and Sabang. This increased India's influence and access to Strait of Malacca, one of the most important choke points for China and rest of the world in terms of trade. That same year, India also got access to Port of Duqm in Oman. The port facilitates India's crude imports from the Persian Gulf. In addition to this, Indian facility is located right next to the two important Chinese ports, Djibouti in Africa and Gwadar in Pakistan. India has also signed an agreement with Seychelles for a naval base in the region, which increases India's presence near the African continent. While doing this, India has also extended credit lines to Iran and agreed to build a port in the country to extend access to trade routes in Central Asia. Additionally, India has extended credit lines in Central Asia to countries like Mongolia, where Prime Minister Modi has agreed to develop a bilateral air corridor. New Delhi has invested a lot in policies to improve relationships with Japan and Vietnam. These relationships have helped increase Indian trade and consequently India's influence on countries around China. India has already started putting its economic growth to good use. It's now lending money to neighbors in order to avoid having them indebted to Chinese loans. It has given $8 billion to Bangladesh, $2.1 billion to bail out Sri Lanka, $1.7 billion to Nepal, and $13 billion to Maldives. While India lags far behind China in overseas lending, New Delhi has stepped up its effort in recent years, providing tens of billions of dollars in credit to neighboring countries. Indian companies have also expanded rapidly in the region, providing a counterweight to Chinese commercial activity. Indian policymakers see countering the BRI as vital to avoid being surrounded by pro-Chinese governments and infrastructure they speculate could one day serve Beijing's military interest. India has definitely stepped up its efforts in containing China. India publicly downplays the competition with China, but its actions show India doesn't want to be held hostage to China's economic or military might. On top of all this, India has also formed two partnerships with the USA that's scaring China. First, we have IMEC and the second is Quad. Let's go into both one by one. Just back in September, India, European Union, United States, and Saudi Arabia announced a mega deal to establish the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC. The IMEC is composed of two distinct pathways, the East Corridor linking India to Middle East and the Northern Corridor connecting Middle East to Europe. This expansive network incorporates a railway system, a hydrogen pipeline, and high-capacity optical fiber cables. It supplements existing maritime and land-based transport routes such as the Suez Canal, the North-South Transport Corridor, and China's Silk routes, thereby facilitating smooth transit between India, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and Europe. Given Indian railway industry's proficiency in constructing railway network in arid regions, it is poised to secure a significant portion of contracts from this proposed corridor. The initiative is anticipated to achieve a 40% reduction in time required for transporting Indian goods to Europe. Additionally, it is expected to result in a 30% decrease in the cost of transporting Indian goods to Europe. For the US, this project accomplishes the objective of distancing India from Russia, Iran, and China. For India, this appears to be a well-defined strategy aimed at challenging China's extensive Belt and Road projects. Major blow to China is the fact that Italy, which just withdrew from BRI, has opted into IMEC. Last but not least, the second project that India and US are part of is the Quad. US, India, Japan, and Australia form the alliance nicknamed Quad. The Quad is seen as a security-focused grouping structured to deter Chinese aggression, whether it be BRI-related or not. Following its reconstitution, the Quad formed working groups in 2021 focused on issues of utmost importance, including vaccines, infrastructure, climate change, critical and emerging technologies, cybersecurity, and humanitarian assistance. This signals the Quad's commitment to delivering real results to regional partners beyond security concerns. This doesn't mean that Quad is not security-focused at all. Quad regularly performs military exercises to help establish and enhance interoperability between capable naval forces and align operating procedures for emergency response. Every time Quad holds a military exercise, China is quick to denounce it, saying it hurts China's safety. But in reality, the Quad has played a big role in deterring Chinese aggression. By harnessing ambiguity, the Quad can endure and grow as a reliable source of public good, contributing to regional prosperity and keeping great power tensions at a manageable level. All this combined has created quite an issue for BRI and CCP as a whole.